I stood on my front porch holding a piece of paper that effectively erased me from my own life. My daughter-in-law had just served me with an emergency no-contact order claiming I was a violent threat to her unborn child. But as I watched her cry crocodile tears from the back of a police cruiser, I realized this was not about safety at all. It was a hostile takeover. She had used the law to lock me out of my own property. What she did not know was that the man she was trying to destroy had built his empire from dirt and sweat during the hardest decades in this country, and I was about to teach her exactly what happens when you corner a lion in his own den. My name is Gordon Ellis. I am 69 years old, and before I tell you how I tore her manipulative world apart in a courtroom, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that family ties do not give anyone the right to steal your life's work. The banging on my front door was not the polite knock of a neighbor. It was heavy, rhythmic, and carried the undeniable weight of authority. It was a Tuesday morning, crisp and quiet in my upscale Atlanta neighborhood, but that peace shattered the moment I opened the heavy oak door. Two uniformed police officers stood on my porch. Their hands rested close to their utility belts. They did not smile. They did not offer a polite good morning or ask how I was doing. The taller officer stepped forward, his eyes scanning me with cold, professional detachment. "Are you Gordon Ellis?" I nodded, keeping my posture rigid. I have worked hard my entire life to buy this house to earn the respect of my community, and I was not about to cower on my own front step. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady. The officer handed me a thick manila folder. "You are being served with an emergency no-contact order. You are hereby ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from Heather Ellis and Kendrick Ellis. You are prohibited from calling, texting, emailing, or contacting them through any third party." I stared at the folder. The legal jargon stamped on the front felt like a physical blow. A no-contact order. I am a retired general contractor. I spend my days managing my investments and maintaining my property. I have never raised my hand to anyone outside of a boxing ring in my youth. The officer continued reading the stipulations with a mechanical drone listing restrictions that treated me like a violent criminal. "If you violate any of these terms, you will be arrested immediately. Do you understand these conditions?" I took the folder. The paper felt unnaturally heavy in my calloused hands. I did not ask questions. I did not raise my voice or act defensive. Decades in the construction business taught me that reacting with anger only gives your opponents the upper hand. I simply looked the officer in the eye and said, "I understand." But as I signed the acknowledgement receipt, my mind raced. A protective order requires an affidavit. It requires a sworn statement of fear or abuse presented to a judge. Someone had walked into a courthouse and sworn under oath that I was a monster. I did not have to guess who. I looked past the officers toward the street. Parked at the curb was a white police SUV. Through the tinted back window I could see her. Heather, my 32-year-old daughter-in-law. She was sitting in the back seat, clutching her slightly rounded stomach, her face buried in her hands as her shoulders shook with exaggerated sobs. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. The terrified pregnant woman seeking refuge from her tyrannical father-in-law. Standing outside the vehicle, leaning against the passenger door, was Kendrick, my 35-year-old son. The boy I had raised to be a man, the boy I had funded through college and set up in business. He stood there with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed firmly on the asphalt. He did not look at the house. He did not look at me. He looked like a beaten dog, completely submissive to the woman sobbing in the back seat. That cowardice hurt worse than the legal document in my hand. I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Mrs. Higgins from next door had stopped watering her lawn. The gentleman across the street was standing at the end of his driveway, arms crossed. The whole neighborhood was watching the proud, successful Gordon Ellis get a visit from the police. Heather knew exactly what she was doing. She chose this public display to inflict maximum humiliation. She wanted to break my reputation before she broke my bank accounts. The officers turned and walked back to their vehicles. I closed the front door, the heavy click of the deadbolt echoing in the silent foyer. I walked into my study and sat in my leather chair. I opened the folder and began reading the specific allegations. The words were venomous. She claimed I had subjected her to severe emotional abuse. She stated I had stalked her movements, controlled their finances tyrannically, and created an environment so stressful it threatened the life of her unborn child. but it was the final page that made my blood run entirely cold. It was a property restriction clause. The order explicitly banned me from stepping foot on the premises of the Oak Ridge Commercial Complex. That complex was not a family home. It was a prime piece of commercial real estate I had purchased entirely with my own cash 3 years ago. I had put Kendrick as the managing director to give him a sense of responsibility and ownership, but the property was mine. Now the court was legally barring me from my own $2 million asset. The pieces of the puzzle began to snap together with terrifying clarity. This was not a hysterical reaction from a stressed pregnant woman. This was a calculated surgical strike. You do not ban a man from a commercial property unless you are trying to take absolute control of that property. Heather had worked as a loan officer before she married Kendrick. She knew how banks worked. She knew how asset management worked. And she clearly knew how to exploit the legal system to tie my hands behind my back. A sudden cold realization washed over me. The Oak Ridge complex was held in a specific trust, and the original physical deeds the bearer shares and the foundational operating documents were not at my lawyer's office. They were right here in my house. I stood up so fast my chair hit the wall behind me. I walked down the hall to the walk-in closet in my master bedroom. I pulled back the false paneling behind my winter coats to reveal my heavy steel wall safe. My hands were steady as I spun the dial. 32. Left to 14. Right to 47. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. I reached into the top compartment where I kept my most vital legal documents. My fingers brushed against empty space. I pulled out the remaining folders and threw them onto the bed. Birth certificates were there. Passports were there. Old tax returns were there. But the thick blue folder containing every original document proving my sole ownership of the Oak Ridge Commercial Complex was gone. The space was completely empty. I stood frozen, staring into the dark metal void of the safe. There were no signs of forced entry. The lock had not been tampered with. The metal was perfectly intact. There were only 2 people in the entire world who knew the combination to that safe: me and my son Kendrick. The no-contact order was not a shield to protect a frightened woman. It was a gag order. It was a locked door designed to keep me paralyzed while they walked away with my life's work. They had robbed me blind, and then they had the police order me to stay away while they did it. Looking at my empty hands, I remembered exactly what they used to look like back in 1982. Atlanta was a very different city then. A young black man trying to break into the commercial construction business did not get bank loans or firm handshakes. He got doors slammed directly in his face. I mixed concrete until my knuckles split open and bled onto the pavement. I hauled heavy timber until my spine felt like a collection of shattered glass. I swallowed bitter insults from white site managers who called me boy while I did the heavy lifting of 3 grown men. I did not complain. I channeled that rage into my work. I built my company brick by bloody brick. Every dollar that was supposed to be in this safe was soaked in my sweat and my sacrifice. I endured that relentless humiliation so my son would never have to know the bitter taste of it. I paid for his exclusive private schools. I bought him his first tailored suit when he graduated. I wanted to forge a strong king. Instead, I raised a pathetic court jester. Kendrick grew up incredibly soft. His hands are perfectly manicured. He never had to fight for a seat at the table, so he never learned how to hold one. He let a manipulative woman like Heather, a woman who expertly weaponized her fake tears and her societal privilege, put a tight leash around his neck. He chose to hide behind her maternity dress rather than stand face to face with the man who gave him everything. The ultimate betrayal was not just the theft itself, it was the absolute sickening weakness of it. I had survived a harsh, unforgiving world by facing my enemies directly head-on. My own flesh and blood could not even look me in the eye while he robbed his own father. I closed the heavy steel door of the safe, running my fingers over the cold metal dial. The metallic clank echoed through the quiet bedroom. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for people who do not know how to fix problems. I am a builder. I look at the structural integrity of a situation and I find the stress points. The logic was cold and undeniable. There were no signs of forced entry. The security system had not been triggered. Only Kendrick had the access code. I gave it to him 2 years ago in case I ever had a medical emergency. He used that ultimate trust to clear out the lifeblood of my estate. But the theft was only the first layer of their scheme. The brilliance of Heather's plan was the no-contact order. It was not just a piece of paper, it was a perfectly designed legal trap. If I noticed the missing documents and called Kendrick to demand them back, I would be violating the order. The police would arrest me for harassment. If I drove to the Oak Ridge Commercial Complex to secure my own offices and lock them out, I would be violating the proximity clause. They would have me handcuffed in the parking lot in front of my own tenants. If I sent a mutual friend to ask them what they were doing, it would count as third-party contact. I would go straight to a holding cell. Heather had anticipated my every possible reaction and legally paralyzed me. She knew that as a black man facing a distraught, crying white woman claiming abuse, the system would not give me the benefit of the doubt. She banked on the historical bias of the authorities. The police would not listen to a father claiming his son stole some papers when there was an active protective order in place. They had effectively tied my hands behind my back and shoved me into a dark corner. Most men would lose their minds. Most men would drive over there in a blind rage and play right into her hands, ending up behind bars exactly as she planned. But I am not most men. I sat on the edge of my bed and let the cold reality wash over me. They wanted me to act out of anger. They needed me to validate the false narrative she swore under oath. By doing absolutely nothing, by sitting completely still in my silent house, I was already ruining the next phase of her performance. But sitting still did not mean surrendering. It meant calculating the precise trajectory of my counterattack. I needed someone who could navigate the legal minefield without stepping on the tripwires Heather had carefully laid out. I picked up my phone. I bypassed my contacts list and dialed a number I knew by heart. Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was not a gentle family lawyer. He was a ruthless corporate litigator. He treated the courtroom like a slaughterhouse, and he owed me a massive favor from a zoning dispute a decade ago. I left a brief message with Jonathan's answering service instructing him to look into the deed and current status of the Oak Ridge Commercial Complex immediately. I told him to treat it as a level 1 emergency. The rest of the day moved at an agonizing crawl. I did not leave the house. I did not answer the random phone calls that came through. I stayed in my study drinking black coffee and mapping out every single asset, every bank account, and every vulnerability I had left. I was reinforcing the foundation of my life. Night fell over Atlanta. The house grew completely dark save for the single desk lamp illuminating my legal pads. The silence was heavy. At exactly 12:45 in the morning, my cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany desk. It was Jonathan. I answered on the first ring. "Gordon," Jonathan said. His voice lacked its usual smooth confidence. It was tight-laced with genuine urgency. I pulled the county property records and ran a deep background check on the Oak Ridge Trust. I listened to his steady breathing on the other end of the line. "Give it to me straight, Jonathan," I said. "I do not need you to sugarcoat it." "Gordon, they did not just steal the physical documents to hold them hostage." Jonathan explained his words, cutting through the quiet room like a serrated blade. "They used those original deeds to approach a private lending firm, a firm known for fast approvals and minimal oversight. They bypassed the traditional banks entirely." My grip on the phone tightened. "How much?" $500,000, Jonathan replied. "They took out a home equity line of credit for $500,000 against the Oak Ridge complex. The funds were fully dispersed yesterday afternoon right into a newly opened joint account." I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. "The Oak Ridge Trust is solely in my name," I stated, keeping my tone deadly calm. "Kendrick is a managing director, but he has zero authorization to encumber the property. He cannot sign for a loan." "I know, Gordon," Jonathan said, taking a sharp breath. "Kendrick did not sign as the guarantor." "You did." I paused, the silence stretching between us. "I did not sign any loan documents, Jonathan. I have not been to a lending office in 3 years. Jonathan's voice dropped an octave, delivering the final, devastating blow. "I am looking at the digital copy of the promissory note right now, Gordon. It has your social security number, your driver's license number, and a perfect replica of your signature on the bottom line. They forged your name to steal $500,000 in cash." The air in my study turned instantly toxic. A forged signature. $500,000. I closed my eyes and let the reality of Jonathan's words sink deep into my bones. Kendrick did not have the brains or the nerve to pull off high-level mortgage fraud. He was too cowardly to even look me in the eye on my own front porch. This had Heather written all over it in bold red ink. Before she sank her claws into my son, Heather worked as a senior loan officer for a regional commercial bank. She spent 5 years learning the exact architecture of the lending industry. She knew the loopholes. She knew exactly which private lenders prioritize speed over due diligence. She knew what secondary identification was required, how to bypass standard notary checks using digital portals, and how to push a massive line of credit through underwriting without raising red flags. She had weaponized her professional knowledge to bypass the security of my trust. The sheer audacity of it sent a wave of pure, unfiltered rage coursing through my veins. It was a hot, blinding anger, the kind of fury that makes a man want to grab his keys, drive his truck through a set of wrought iron gates, and demand his money and his son's spine back. My hands gripped the edge of my mahogany desk so hard the wood groaned. I could picture it perfectly. I could drive over to their pristine suburban house, the one I put the down payment on, and kick the front door straight off its hinges. I could stand over them and make them look me in the eye. But as quickly as the fire flared, the icy reality of my situation extinguished it. I looked down at the manila folder sitting on my desk. The no-contact order. That was her masterpiece. Heather had anticipated my anger. She was banking on it entirely. If I drove over there, if I even sent an angry text message demanding my money back, I would be violating the judge's order. The police would be at their house in 3 minutes. They would arrest me for harassment, violation of a protective order, and domestic intimidation. A wealthy, angry black man showing up at the door of a crying, supposedly pregnant white woman. The justice system would not pause to check the property deeds. They would lock me in a cell, destroy my credibility, and Heather would have free rein to drain every last cent while I sat behind bars waiting for a bail hearing. I let out a long, slow breath. I am a man of discipline. You do not survive the construction business by losing your temper when a foundation cracks. You secure the structure, you assess the damage, and you rebuild. I told Jonathan to lock down everything he could from his end, but to file absolutely nothing with the courts just yet. I told him we needed them to feel safe, to feel like they had won the battle. I hung up the phone, sat back in the darkness of my study, and let a cold, calculated calm wash over me. I was not going to break the law. I was going to use it to strangle them. When the sun rose the next morning, I did not feel tired. I felt a razor-sharp clarity. I brewed a pot of black coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I placed the court order right next to my keyboard. I read the stipulations again, line by line. The judge had ordered a complete and total separation. I was strictly forbidden from communicating with them, interacting with them, or providing any ongoing interference in their lives. Well, if the court demanded total separation, they were going to get exactly that. Total, absolute, and merciless separation. I call it malicious compliance. For 3 years, I had heavily subsidized their luxurious lifestyle. Kendrick's salary from the commercial complex barely covered their basic mortgage and property taxes. The rest of their extravagant life was built on a foundation of my hard-earned money. I picked up my phone and made my first call. I dialed the executive client line for American Express. Kendrick and Heather carried supplementary black cards tied directly to my primary account. Those cards paid for her designer clothes, their 5-star dinners, and their weekend getaways. Within 5 minutes, I spoke to a representative, confirmed my identity, and reported both supplementary cards as compromised and permanently canceled. I explicitly instructed the bank not to issue replacements under any circumstances. Next, I pulled up the financing documents for Heather's vehicle. She drove a brand new Mercedes-Benz SUV. When she wanted it, Kendrick's credit was not strong enough to secure the premium interest rate, so I stepped in and signed as the primary financial guarantor. I called the auto finance company. I informed them that due to a sudden and severe change in family circumstances legally mandated by a court order, I was immediately withdrawing my financial guarantee on the vehicle. The representative warned me that withdrawing my guarantee would trigger an automatic default clause unless the primary driver could refinance the loan within 48 hours. I told them that was not my problem. If she could not refinance it, they were free to send the repo men to pick it up. My third call was to my wealth management firm. I maintained a highly premium private health insurance policy that covered myself, Kendrick, and by extension his wife. It was a gold tier plan that covered everything from private hospital suites to elective procedures. I instructed my broker to immediately remove Kendrick and Heather from the policy. The broker was hesitant, noting that Heather was allegedly pregnant, and removing her would leave them entirely uninsured. I read him the exact wording of the no-contact order. I explained that the court had legally severed our relationship and barred me from any involvement in their lives. Providing health insurance constituted a financial entanglement that I was no longer legally comfortable maintaining. He processed the removal without another word. Within 2 hours, I had completely dismantled the financial safety net they had taken for granted. I sat back and took a sip of my coffee. I pictured Heather walking into a high-end baby boutique later that afternoon, handing the cashier her black card only to have the machine decline it. I imagined Kendrick trying to log into the insurance portal and finding his access completely revoked. They wanted to use the law to kick me out of their lives. I was simply following the judge's orders to the exact letter. I was giving them the ultimate gift of financial independence. It was a cold, ruthless satisfaction knowing I had cut their oxygen supply without ever crossing the line the judge had drawn. I was not being vindictive. I was just being compliant. The financial amputation was complete. I felt a temporary surge of control, a brief moment of triumph in my quiet kitchen. I had stopped the bleeding on my personal accounts, but the ghost of that $500,000 loan still haunted the room. Heather had managed to secure $500,000 using my forged signature, and that cash was currently sitting in a joint account she controlled. I knew her well enough to know she would not just leave it there. A woman who goes through the trouble of forging a legal document and filing a fake restraining order does not let the prize sit idle. Suddenly, my laptop chimed. It was an urgent email notification. Because of my extensive real estate portfolio, I utilized an advanced financial monitoring service that tracked any large-scale movement tied to my social security number and corporate tax profiles. Even though she had opened the loan with a private lender, the money trail was still tangentially connected to my identity profile. I clicked the email open. The subject line read, "Critical alert, large volume wire transfers detected." My eyes scanned the data flashing across the screen. The $500,000 was no longer resting in their local bank account. It was moving. But it was not moving in one massive lump sum, which would immediately trigger federal anti-money laundering alarms. It was moving in rapid sequential chunks of $9,900. It is a classic financial evasion tactic known as smurfing, designed specifically to stay just under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold. I watched the live ledger update on my screen. The money was hemorrhaging out of Atlanta. I traced the routing numbers attached to the outgoing wires. The funds were not going to another domestic bank. They were being wired directly to a series of offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. But the most explosive piece of information was not the destination. It was the name of the beneficiary attached to the receiving accounts. It was not Kendrick. It was not a corporate shell company. The name on the offshore accounts was Travis, Heather's older brother, a man with a known history of failed businesses and shady real estate flips. Heather was not just stealing my money to fund her life with my son. She was laundering $500,000 of my stolen cash out of the country directly into the hands of her own family. It did not take long for the financial guillotine to drop. I knew the exact moment Heather tried to swipe that canceled American Express card. 2 hours later, my phone began to vibrate relentlessly against the surface of my desk. It was not Heather or Kendrick calling. The judge had explicitly forbidden them from contacting me, and Heather was far too cunning to violate her own protective order. Instead, the calls and messages were pouring in from local business associates, members of my country club, and even distant relatives. I unlocked my screen and found a link sent to me by an old friend. It led directly to a video posted on multiple social media platforms. I clicked play and watched a masterclass in modern digital manipulation. Heather sat on the plush sofa in her living room, the exact sofa I had paid for 3 years ago. The lighting was perfectly dim. She wore no makeup and her hair was tied back in a messy knot to emphasize her carefully manufactured distress. She cradled her slightly protruding stomach with both hands, looking directly into the camera with wide, tear-filled eyes. She did not use my name, but she painted a picture so vivid that anyone in our community knew exactly who she was talking about. She spun a narrative of absolute terror. She claimed she was a vulnerable pregnant woman being financially starved and emotionally terrorized by a wealthy, domineering, and controlling patriarch. She weaponized every societal bias available to her. She played the fragile, defenseless victim who had just been stripped of her health insurance and the vehicle she needed to get to her medical appointments. She cried on camera, begging the public for prayers, stating she was terrified of what this powerful, vindictive man might do next to harm her unborn child. The video was an immediate viral sensation. The comment section was a toxic wasteland of public outrage. Strangers from all over the country were calling for my absolute destruction. Local community groups began sharing the post, framing me as a ruthless tyrant abusing his pregnant white daughter-in-law. I could feel the invisible weight of public judgment crashing down on my house. By late afternoon, a local news van was parked at the end of my street. My reputation, the good name I had spent 4 decades building from the ground up with bleeding hands and an unbroken moral code, was being dragged through the mud for millions of people to see. Heather was attempting to execute me in the court of public opinion, hoping the pressure would force me to surrender my assets just to make the nightmare stop. I closed the laptop and pushed it away. Let them talk. Let the neighbors whisper behind their drawn curtains. Let the internet outrage mob scream at their screens. A lion does not turn his head when a small dog barks. I knew that engaging in a public shouting match with a crying woman would only validate her performance. I needed ammunition that could not be argued with, debated, or dismissed by a sympathetic audience. I needed raw, undeniable facts. I walked to my study and opened a small floor safe hidden beneath the rug. Unlike the wall safe Kendrick had accessed, this one was entirely off the grid. It contained stacks of crisp, untraceable $100 bills. If I paid for an investigator using my bank accounts, Heather's legal team might eventually subpoena those records during discovery and anticipate my counterattack. I needed this operation to remain completely submerged in the shadows. I placed $10,000 in cash inside a heavy leather satchel. Then I drove through the back streets of Atlanta to a nondescript office building in the industrial district. I walked into the office of a private investigator named Griffin. Griffin was an ex-federal agent who did not care about viral videos, neighborhood gossip, or emotional manipulation. He cared about paper trails, digital footprints, and hard evidence. I sat across from him and laid the $10,000 on his metal desk. I gave him the names, the offshore routing numbers, and the social media video. I gave Griffin a very specific set of directives. I did not want him wasting time taking photos of them at coffee shops. I needed him to dig into the marrow of Heather's life. I wanted every detail on her brother Travis and his sudden windfall in the Cayman Islands. But more importantly, I told Griffin to tear into Heather's medical background. Something about that pregnancy did not sit right with my gut. A woman who systematically plans a $500,000 fraud and files a tactical restraining order does not leave her health to chance. I wanted clinic names, appointment logs, and billing records. I wanted to know exactly what was growing inside my daughter-in-law. Griffin swept the cash into his drawer without counting it, nodded once, and told me he would be in touch. For 3 days I lived in absolute silence. I ignored the news vans, I ignored the hateful emails pouring into my business accounts. I adhered strictly to the judge's order, making zero contact with Kendrick or his wife. I simply waited. On the evening of the 4th day, the doorbell rang. I checked the security cameras. A courier in a plain uniform dropped a thick, unmarked gray envelope on my welcome mat and walked away. I retrieved the envelope, carried it into my study, and locked the door. I sliced the heavy paper open with a letter opener. The contents spilled out onto the dark wood of my desk. Griffin was worth every single dollar. The first document was a comprehensive medical background check. It showed that Heather had not visited an obstetrician or a gynecologist in over 2 years. There were no blood tests, no prenatal prescriptions, and absolutely no medical bills indicating a pregnancy. I sifted through the pile and pulled out a high-resolution printout of the ultrasound image Heather had posted on her social media to garner public sympathy. Attached to it was a reverse image search report conducted by Griffin. The ultrasound was not hers. It was a stock photograph purchased from a medical imaging database for $29. My hands moved faster now, uncovering the final devastating piece of evidence. It was a purchase receipt from an obscure specialty effects company based in California. The shipping address matched Kendrick and Heather's house. The item listed on the invoice was a high-grade custom-matched medical silicone prosthetic belly. Designed for film productions to mimic a second trimester pregnancy, there was no baby. There never was a baby. My daughter-in-law was strapping a piece of synthetic rubber to her waist every morning. She had completely fabricated a human life to secure an emergency protective order, steal my money, and legally bind my hands. I laid the silicone belly receipt next to the forged bank documents and the stock ultrasound photo. The entire architecture of Heather's master plan suddenly materialized in my mind with crystal clarity. The fake pregnancy was not just a prop to secure an emergency restraining order. It was the foundation of a massive calculated extortion scheme. I sat back in my chair and asked myself a simple logical question. What happens when 9 months pass and there is no child to deliver? A woman as calculating as Heather does not paint herself into a corner without a meticulously planned exit strategy. The pregnancy had to end prematurely. She was planning to stage a traumatic miscarriage, and I knew exactly who she was going to blame when it happened. She would file a massive civil lawsuit claiming that the extreme emotional distress, the financial starvation, and the relentless intimidation inflicted by her tyrannical father-in-law caused the loss of her unborn baby. She would parade in front of a judge and a jury weeping hysterically for a child that never existed. In a wrongful death and emotional distress lawsuit, she would not just ask for a cash settlement. She would demand the Oak Ridge commercial complex. She would leverage the public outrage, the viral social media videos, and the intense legal pressure to force me to sign over the deed to the $2 million property just to make the nightmare stop. The $500,000 loan was only the appetizer to fund her brother and give her a safety net. The commercial real estate was the main course. The sheer magnitude of her malice was almost impressive. She was weaponizing the justice system and manipulating societal sympathies to execute a perfect heist. I picked up my phone and called Jonathan Pierce. I told him to clear his entire schedule and meet me at his office immediately. When I arrived, I slid the private investigator's gray folder across his massive glass desk. I watched my ruthless pit bull of a lawyer turn completely pale as he read through the blank medical records and the invoice for the silicone belly. He looked up at me completely stunned by the audacity of the fraud. I did not give him time to process his shock. I gave him strict orders. I told him we were not going to expose her fake pregnancy to the police today. If we struck now, she would simply claim she lost the baby early due to the stress of my investigation, effectively accelerating her timeline and keeping her victim narrative intact. We needed her to act first. We needed her to commit an undeniable, irreversible federal crime fueled entirely by her own monumental greed. I instructed Jonathan to establish an anonymous shell corporation in the state of Delaware immediately. We named it Apex Holdings, LLC. Delaware corporate law is famously airtight when it comes to financial privacy. It completely shields the identities of the true corporate owners behind registered agents, making the ownership structure entirely untraceable to anyone looking from the outside. I wired $2 million in pure liquid cash from my offshore reserves directly into the newly formed corporate account. Apex Holdings was going to be our ultimate Trojan horse. We were going to pose as an aggressive, cash-rich real estate investment firm looking to acquire premium commercial space in Atlanta. We were going to approach Heather with an unsolicited, highly lucrative offer to buy the Oak Ridge commercial complex. I knew her overwhelming greed would blind her to any potential risks. I knew she would try to sell a property she did not legally own to secure a massive immediate payday before she had to execute her fake miscarriage performance. We were going to hand her the rope and she was going to tie the noose herself. The legal trap was officially set. The steel jaws were wide open, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for her to take the final step. I spent the next few days in the quiet solitude of my home, ignoring the continuing media circus outside my gates. I watched the rain batter the large windows of my study as a heavy, late summer storm rolled into Atlanta. The weather brought a suffocating humidity and relentless cracking thunder that shook the floorboards. It was exactly 2 in the morning when the silent perimeter alarm on my security console flashed a bright red warning across the screen. I sat up straight in my leather chair. The motion sensors at the front security gate had been violently tripped. I switched my desktop monitor to the main driveway camera. Through the heavy distortion of the torrential rain and the green tint of the infrared night vision, a figure stumbled up my driveway. They moved with a frantic, uneven limp, slipping on the wet pavement. I switched to the front porch camera just as the figure collapsed heavily against my thick oak door. A wet, shaking fist began pounding frantically against the wood. I zoomed in on the high-definition monitor. It was Kendrick. My son was completely drenched to the bone. His expensive designer shirt was plastered to his skin, soaked in rain and mud. His face was contorted in absolute unfiltered panic. He kept looking wildly over his shoulder into the dark, rain-swept street, acting exactly like a hunted animal cornered by a predator. By stepping foot on my property, he was directly violating the very no-contact order he and his wife had begged a judge to sign. The hypocrisy of his presence was sickening. He pounded on the door again, his mouth moving rapidly as he shouted into the storm. I synced the outdoor audio feed to my desktop speakers. His voice cracked through the static, raw, broken, and utterly desperate. "Dad, please open the door. You have to let me in. She is crazy. She is going to destroy me. Please. Dad, I am begging you, save my life." I watched the high-resolution monitor as the torrential rain lashed relentlessly against Kendrick's back. The thunder masked the sound of his initial sobs, but the highly sensitive security microphones embedded in the porch ceiling picked up every pathetic, breathless whimper. He slid down the heavy wood of my front door, collapsing in a heap onto the wet welcome mat. His hands clawed frantically at the brass handle, shaking with a terror I had never seen in him before. He begged for shelter, but he was not begging like a man who had realized the profound moral error of his ways. He was begging like a cornered rat fleeing a rapidly sinking ship. His expensive designer shirt was completely ruined, plastered to his skin, by the freezing rain stripping away the wealthy facade he loved to project. I leaned closer to the microphone receiver on my desk. I did not say a single word. I simply let the silence draw the poison out of his system. People who are terrified of silence will always fill the void with their darkest confessions. Kendrick looked directly up at the camera lens, the infrared light reflecting off his wide, panicked eyes. He knew I was watching. "Dad, I know you are there," he cried out, wiping a mixture of rain and snot from his face. "I know you can hear me right now." She is completely out of her mind. Heather has lost her mind. I did not want to do it. I swear to God on my life, I did not want to open your safe. She made me do it. She manipulated me. She told me her brother Travis was in deep trouble with some very dangerous people down in Florida, and he needed cash immediately to stay alive. She swore to me that we just needed to borrow the property documents to secure a temporary short-term loan. She promised me we would pay every single cent back before you ever even noticed the folder was missing. His voice cracked into a high-pitched wail entirely devoid of dignity. I watched my own flesh and blood, the sole heir to the Ellis legacy, completely abdicate responsibility for his treacherous actions. He was a 35-year-old man aggressively blaming his wife for forcing his hand. He continued to spill every meticulous detail of their conspiracy onto my digital recording. He sobbed that when he hesitated to give her the code to the wall safe, Heather packed a heavy suitcase and stood at the front door. She threatened to walk out of his life forever. She told him he would never see her again. More importantly, she weaponized the ultimate vulnerability. She swore he would never lay eyes on his unborn child. She told him she would move out of state, change her identity, and ensure the baby never knew its grandfather or its cowardly father. She manipulated his paternal instincts using the very life supposedly growing inside her belly. He cried that he was just trying to protect his newly forming family. He claimed he only opened the safe to save his marriage and secure his rights as a desperate father. But then he realized she was not just getting a small, manageable loan to bail out Travis. She forged your signature, Dad. She faked your total approval on the bank underwriting forms. Now she is actively talking to real estate brokers behind my back. She is talking about selling the entire Oak Ridge complex from right under us to get a massive cash payout. I tried to stop her tonight. I told her we had gone way too far and we needed to confess. She laughed right in my face. She said the viral video made her untouchable. She said if I tried to warn you or go to the police to stop the sale, she would tell the authorities I was the primary mastermind. She said she would claim I physically abused her and violently forced her to forge the papers. She told me she would make sure I went to federal prison while she walked away with the money and the child. I stood perfectly still in the dim, cool light of my study. My right hand hovered over the security console. I did not reach for the button to unlock the front door. I reached directly for the primary recording switch. I engaged the local hard drive backup and the encrypted cloud server synchronization simultaneously. I was capturing every single frame of video and every single decibel of audio. The camera feed was stamping the exact date and time across the bottom of the screen. I was legally capturing Kendrick openly admitting that Heather orchestrated the forgery, that she stole the confidential documents, and that she was currently attempting to sell stolen property through extortion. He was handing me the master key to their absolute destruction on a silver platter. A small, weak part of my mind, the part that remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle in the park and tying his necktie for his high school graduation, felt a brief, stinging flicker of sorrow. But that soft part of my heart died the exact moment I saw him standing beside that police cruiser, letting his wife serve me with a fraudulent restraining order. As a builder, I know that when you find a rotten wooden beam inside a house, you do not try to patch it. You cut it out completely, or it will eventually bring down the entire structure. Kendrick was a rotten beam. You cannot build a lasting empire on a foundation of sentimentality. You cannot protect a legacy by opening your front door to a traitor, even if that traitor shares your last name and your bloodline. A man who allows another person to step on his father's neck due to sheer unadulterated cowardice does not deserve sanctuary. He deserves the full wrath of the storm. I leaned forward and pressed the two-way intercom button. My voice echoed out onto the porch through the external waterproof speakers. It was cold, deep, and utterly devoid of any paternal warmth. You made your choice, Kendrick. You chose to let a woman manipulate you into robbing the man who clothed you, fed you, and built your entire world from nothing. You chose to hide behind her fake tears while she dragged my hard-earned reputation through the public dirt. You handed over the keys to the castle because you lacked the spine to stand your ground and defend your own family. You are no victim here. You are an active accomplice. The microphone picked up his sharp, desperate gasp. Dad, please open the door. I am your son. You cannot leave me out here in the dark. I spoke my final words directly into the microphone. And Ellis does not cower. You picked your side. Now you have to survive it. I released the button, cutting the feed. I reached over and turned off the live monitor, plunging the room into darkness. I walked upstairs, got into my bed, and slept soundly while the storm raged violently outside. The torrential rain had stopped completely by the time the morning sun crested the Atlanta skyline. The air was thick and suffocatingly humid, washing away the remnants of the chaotic night. I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking my black coffee and reviewing the synchronized audio files from the security system when my phone rang. It was Jonathan Pierce. He did not bother with a polite morning greeting or small talk. His tone was sharp, aggressive, and entirely focused on the battlefield ahead. Gordon, the bait has been taken entirely, Jonathan announced with a predatory sharpness. I just received an automated notification from our inside contacts at the county family court. Heather's attorney filed an emergency ex parte motion at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. She is officially petitioning the presiding judge for a total judicial override to sell the Oak Ridge commercial complex immediately. I took a slow, measured sip of my hot coffee, feeling the caffeine sharpen my focus. What is her official legal justification for this rapid sale? Jonathan read directly from the electronic legal filing on his screen. She claims that due to your extreme financial abuse, specifically your malicious and sudden cancellation of her health insurance, auto financing, and primary credit accounts, she has been left completely destitute. She states to the court that she requires immediate liquidation of marital assets to ensure the medical survival of her highly at-risk unborn child and to secure safe housing away from your alleged tyranny. She is presenting an anonymous cash offer she received yesterday for $2 million. The buyer is offering a 7-day all-cash close with zero contingencies. She is begging the judge to fast-track the sale to Apex Holdings LLC without your input, claiming it is a literal matter of life and death. A grim, satisfied smile spread across my face. Heather was moving exactly according to the intricate blueprint I had drawn for her. Her overwhelming greed and panic had blinded her to the basic principles of commercial due diligence. She was rushing the courts to sell a property she did not legally own, using a forged background to a buyer she did not realize was me. The trap was no longer just set. The steel jaws had officially snapped shut. The reality of Heather's emergency motion meant the clock was now ticking against us with alarming speed. Family courts are notoriously unpredictable battlegrounds. They operate heavily on emotion optics and the preservation of perceived vulnerable dependents. If the presiding judge looked at Heather, saw a weeping pregnant woman claiming extreme financial abuse, and granted her the judicial override to sell the Oak Ridge complex, we would be thrown into a massive legal quagmire. Untangling a commercial property title after a court-sanctioned sale to a third party would take years of expensive litigation. Furthermore, if she managed to successfully liquidate the asset and disappear, the $500,000 home equity line of credit she secured with my forged signature would remain firmly attached to the property and to Kendrick. I had already decided that my son needed to face the harsh consequences of his cowardice, but I absolutely refused to allow this manipulative woman to bankrupt my family name and walk away into the sunset with millions of dollars in stolen cash. I had to ensure she sold the property to me and only me under the guise of Apex Holdings. I sat in Jonathan's office later that afternoon, staring at the sprawling skyline of downtown Atlanta through his floor-to-ceiling windows. We had to move aggressively. Heather was desperate. Desperation breeds speed, but it also breeds critical mistakes. I told Jonathan to authorize our third-party commercial broker to make the formal approach. We used a highly reputable broker who operated strictly on commission and had absolutely no idea that Gordon Ellis was the silent backer funding Apex Holdings. To the broker, Apex was simply a deep-pocketed Delaware-based investment group aggressively looking to park capital in Atlanta commercial real estate. The broker reached out directly to the listing agent Heather had frantically hired just 2 days prior. We did not offer a lowball figure to start a negotiation. We did not want to give her any reason to pause shop the offer around or invite competing bids that might delay the process. We hit her with a sledgehammer of pure, irresistible financial temptation. Apex Holdings submitted a formal letter of intent to purchase the Oak Ridge Commercial Complex for $2 million. It was a completely full-price offer, but the purchase price was not even the most enticing part of the bait. In the commercial real estate world, a standard transaction takes 30 to 90 days. Buyers demand extensive environmental impact studies, structural engineering reports, deep title searches, and lengthy financing contingencies. We stripped every single one of those hurdles away. Our offer stated that Apex Holdings was executing a 1031 tax-deferred exchange and needed to deploy $2 million in pure liquid cash immediately to avoid severe IRS penalties. We waived the environmental study, we waived the structural inspection, we waived the financing contingency entirely because the cash was already sitting in an escrow account ready to be deployed. We offered a hyper-accelerated 7-day closing period. For a woman who was actively trying to outrun a massive fraud scheme and an allegedly abusive father-in-law, this offer was not just a lifeline, it was a golden chariot sent directly from heaven. Heather thought she had successfully backed me into a corner with the restraining order, and now she believed the universe was rewarding her brilliance with a frictionless multi-million-dollar payday. She did not stop to ask why a faceless Delaware corporation was willing to drop $2 million in cash on a property without sending a single inspector to look at the roof or check the HVAC systems. Greed is a powerful anesthetic. It completely numbs the critical thinking centers of the brain. When you dangle a briefcase full of cash in front of a thief, they will never bother to check if the handle is rigged with explosives. Jonathan monitored the communications between the brokers from his encrypted portal. Heather was acting exactly as predictable as a rat in a maze following the scent of cheese. Her listing agent tried to advise her to at least conduct a basic background check on the buyer, noting that a 7-day all-cash close with zero contingencies was highly unusual, even in a hot market. Heather aggressively shut him down. She instructed him to accept the letter of intent immediately and demand that the formal purchase and sale agreement be drafted by the end of the business day. She was terrified that if she waited even 24 hours, I might find a legal loophole to block the sale, or the phantom buyer might get cold feet and walk away. She pushed her own attorney to draft the binding contracts at breakneck speed. She wanted the legal ink to dry before the family court judge even had a chance to formally review her emergency motion. In her mind, if the contract was fully executed, the judge would simply rubber stamp the sale to prevent the buyer from suing for breach of contract. It was a bold, reckless strategy driven entirely by the illusion of a clean, wealthy getaway. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Jonathan's computer chimed with a secure incoming document. He opened the file and turned the monitor toward me. It was the formal purchase and sale agreement for the Oak Ridge Commercial Complex. I leaned forward and scrutinized the final page. Right there on the bottom line was Heather's digital signature executed via a verified electronic signing portal. Underneath her signature was a standard legal attestation clause. By signing the document, Heather legally swore under penalty of perjury that she had the unencumbered right title and authority to convey the property, and that there were no pending disputes regarding the ownership of the asset. She had completely bypassed Kendrick. She had signed the documents entirely on her own, utilizing the fraudulent power of attorney she had likely drafted when she secured the illegal $500,000 loan. She wanted all the money routed directly into an independent escrow account she controlled, ensuring Kendrick could not touch a single dime of the proceeds. She was fully preparing to leave him holding the bag for the forged loan while she disappeared with the $2 million. I stared at her digital signature on the bright screen. A slow, chilling satisfaction settled deep in my chest. Heather thought she had just outsmarted an old man and secured her ultimate prize. She had no idea what she had actually just done. By legally executing a contract to sell a stolen commercial asset, she had escalated her crimes beyond a simple family dispute or state-level forgery. By transmitting that fraudulent contract across state lines to a Delaware-based corporation via an electronic digital portal, she had officially committed federal wire fraud. She had willfully engaged in a deceptive scheme to defraud an interstate entity out of $2 million. State-level crimes can sometimes be plea bargained away with a sympathetic judge and a good story. Federal crimes are investigated by the FBI, prosecuted by the United States Department of Justice, and carry mandatory minimum prison sentences. Jonathan looked at me, a tight, dangerous smile forming on his face. "We have her, Gordon. She just signed her own arrest warrant." I nodded slowly, standing up from my chair. "Print a hard copy of that contract, Jonathan. Put it in the main file. We are not going to interrupt her celebration just yet. Let her sleep soundly tonight, believing she just won the lottery. Tomorrow, we let the real bloodbath begin." I was sitting in Jonathan's office the morning after Heather digitally signed her own federal indictment. We were reviewing the final details of the Apex Holdings paperwork when Jonathan's desk intercom buzzed. His secretary announced that we had a conference call holding on line 1. The callers identified themselves as Richard and Diane Belmont, Heather's parents. I signaled to Jonathan with a sharp nod. He activated the speakerphone and pressed the blinking red button to start the recording. Under Georgia law, only one party needs to consent to the recording of a telephone conversation. I was that party, and I was more than willing to listen to whatever trap these people wanted to walk into. Gordon Richard began, his voice dripping with an unearned aristocratic arrogance. It was the exact tone of a man who was used to giving orders to valets and country club waiters. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not express any regret for the complete destruction of my family. "I am calling to offer you a pragmatic solution to this very ugly situation you have created. We want to make this easy for you, Gordon. Let us handle this quietly like civilized people." I leaned back in my leather chair. I kept my voice entirely neutral. "What exactly is your pragmatic solution, Richard?" Diane chimed in, her tone laced with a sickening, condescending sweetness. "You have to understand, Gordon, that Heather is under an immense amount of stress. Your kind of lifestyle, the aggressive way you handle your business, it is simply too abrasive for a pregnant woman of her delicate disposition. We know you people often rely on intimidation to get your way in the construction world, but that does not work in polite society. You cannot just bully a young mother." The implicit racism was not lost on me. You people. Aggressive lifestyle. Intimidation. Diane was painting me as a violent thug, completely ignoring the fact that I was a retired multimillionaire sitting in a high-rise law office while her daughter was a common thief. They thought they were talking down to an uneducated laborer. They had no idea they were negotiating with an executioner. "Here is the deal," Gordon Richard continued, taking control of the conversation. "Heather is willing to be reasonable. She will formally request that the judge drop the no-contact order entirely. She will tell the court that she feels safe again, and she will even allow you limited supervised visitations with your grandchild once it is born. But this requires a gesture of good faith on your part. You need to officially transfer the deed of the Oak Ridge Commercial Complex to Kendrick and Heather without any further dispute. You sign over the property cleanly, and all these legal headaches, the police visits, the public scandals, they will all instantly disappear. It is a win for everyone." Jonathan looked at me across the desk, his eyebrows raised in absolute disbelief. Richard and Diane Belmont were not just arrogant, they were spectacularly foolish. What they had just offered on a recorded line was not a negotiation, it was a textbook felony. "Let me make sure I fully understand your proposal, Richard," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly into the recording device. "You are telling me that if I sign over a $2 million commercial property to your daughter, she will voluntarily dismiss a sworn protective order that she previously claimed was a matter of life and death. You are offering a direct quid pro quo involving a judicial mandate in exchange for real estate." Richard scoffed, clearly annoyed that I was dissecting his elegant solution. "Do not play lawyer with me, Gordon. I am giving you a very simple choice. You give up the building, and you get to see your son and your grandchild. If you choose to be stubborn and fight this, we will make sure Heather takes this all the way to a public trial. We will drag your name through every news outlet in Atlanta. You will lose the property anyway, and you will die completely alone. Make the smart choice, Gordon. Give us the building." I did not raise my voice. I did not insult him. I simply said, "I appreciate you clarifying your position, Richard. I will take your generous offer under advisement. Have a wonderful day." Jonathan terminated the call and immediately saved the audio file to his secure server. He let out a low whistle. They just committed extortion, witness tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud in under 4 minutes. They are trying to use a fake domestic violence order to blackmail you out of $2 million. They are desperate, I replied, staring at the phone. They know Heather just signed a contract to sell the property to Apex Holdings, but they want the actual deed signed over from me to legitimize the sale and ensure they get the cash without any title disputes. They are trying to close the loop. Right on cue, the heavy oak door of Jonathan's office swung open. Griffin, my private investigator, walked in holding a thick leather briefcase. He looked tired but deeply satisfied. He dropped a heavy stack of printed documents directly onto Jonathan's glass desk. "I locked down the money trail," Griffin announced, tapping the top of the stack. "Travis Belmont is not just holding that $500,000 in the Cayman Islands. He is actively bleeding it dry. He thought routing it through an offshore shell company would wash the funds, but he is incredibly sloppy." Griffin spread the financial logs and high-resolution photographs across the desk. Travis wired $200,000 back into a personal account in Miami 3 days ago. Yesterday afternoon, he walked into a marine dealership and purchased a luxury center console fishing boat. He paid for it entirely in cash. I have the wire transfer receipts, the bill of sale, and photographs of him posing on the deck of the boat holding a bottle of champagne. But that is not the best part, Griffin continued, pulling out a second set of documents. Travis also had massive, crippling gambling debts. He owed $90,000 to a private sports bookie operating out of Fort Lauderdale, the kind of bookie who breaks legs when you miss a payment. The financial logs show Travis wired exactly $90,000 to an account associated with that operation 48 hours after Heather secured the fraudulent home equity line of credit. I stared at the photographs of Heather's brother smiling on his brand new boat. The $500,000 was already gone. Half of it was spent on luxury toys and illegal debts, and the rest was sitting in an offshore account beyond Kendrick's reach. Heather had completely ruined my son's financial future to bail out her degenerate brother. Kendrick was legally tied to a massive loan, and the money had already evaporated. The entire Belmont family was a syndicate of parasites feeding off the wealth I had built with my bare hands. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect crime. As I analyzed the wire transfer logs, my personal cell phone buzzed violently in my pocket. It was not a call. It was an automated priority alert from my financial monitoring service. I opened the application and read the notification. The private lending firm that issued the $500,000 HELOC had finally triggered a massive internal fraud alert. When I previously initiated the complete lockdown of my credit profiles, it created a delayed shockwave in the financial sector. The bank's risk management department had conducted a secondary review of the Oak Ridge loan. They flagged the digital signature. More importantly, they flagged the immediate suspicious offshore wire transfers that drained the account. The lender had officially frozen the line of credit and issued an immediate demand notice for repayment in full, citing a pending federal fraud investigation. The bank did not send this demand notice to me, because Heather had set up the loan using her home address to intercept the mail. The formal notice of default was delivered via certified courier directly to Kendrick and Heather's front door just moments ago. 10 minutes later, the direct line to my private home office, a number I rarely gave out, began to ring. I had forwarded all my home calls to my mobile device. I looked at the caller ID. It was Heather. The woman who had sworn under oath that she was terrified of me, the woman who had begged a judge for a strict no-contact order, was actively breaking her own protective mandate to call me. I did not answer. I let it go straight to voicemail. Less than a minute later, the voicemail notification popped up on my screen. I played the message on speakerphone for Jonathan and Griffin to hear. Heather's voice was no longer the sweet weeping tone she used for her social media videos. It was completely unhinged, vibrating with raw, unfiltered panic and venomous rage. "Gordon, you vindictive old bastard," she screamed into the phone, her voice cracking. "I know you did this. I know you called the bank and poisoned the loan. You are trying to ruin my life. You are playing sick mind games with a pregnant woman. You think you are so smart cutting off our money, but you are going to pay for this. I will tell the judge you are harassing me. I will tell the police you are threatening my baby. You need to call the bank right now and fix this, or I swear to God I will make sure you rot in a federal prison. I will take your building, I will take your house, and I will leave you with absolutely nothing. Call the bank and fix it." The voicemail clicked off, leaving a heavy, stunned silence in the law office. Heather had just recorded herself violating a judicial order, issuing terroristic threats, attempting to extort a victim, and demanding I fix a fraudulent loan she had illegally obtained. Jonathan smiled, a cold, predatory gleam in his eye. He reached over and carefully saved the audio file to the master evidence folder. "She is drowning, Gordon. The water is filling her lungs and she is thrashing around, dragging everyone down with her." I picked up my coffee and took a slow sip. "Let her thrash," I said, my voice completely devoid of mercy. "Tomorrow we drag her into the courtroom and we watch her sink." The evening before a battle is always the quietest. It is a heavy, suffocating silence that settles over you like a thick wool blanket. I sat alone in my study, the only light coming from the brass reading lamp on my massive mahogany desk. The relentless rain from the previous night had finally stopped leaving the Atlanta air outside my window, stagnant and thick. The media vans had packed up and left my street hours ago, seeking fresh outrage elsewhere, completely unaware that the real story was locked inside my house. I did not turn on the television. I did not listen to the radio. I needed absolute, unbroken focus. I am a man who spent his entire life building commercial structures designed to withstand hurricanes, tornadoes, and the crushing weight of time. You do not survive those destructive elements by bracing for impact and closing your eyes. You survive by knowing exactly where your foundation is anchored and where your opponent's structural weaknesses lie. I began to lay out my weapons across the polished wood. I did not treat them like standard legal documents. I treated them like live ammunition. On the far left side of the desk, I placed the small silver flash drive. That drive contained the high-definition security footage of my own son, drenched in freezing rain, sobbing on my front porch and confessing to the entire criminal conspiracy. It held the crystal-clear audio of Kendrick admitting that Heather blackmailed him, stole the confidential property deeds, and forged my signature to secure a fraudulent loan. Next to the flash drive, I set down the thick gray folder from Griffin, my private investigator. I opened it and spread the contents completely flat. The purchase receipt for the theatrical silicone pregnancy belly from California, the downloaded stock image of the fake ultrasound, the blank medical records proving Heather had not seen an obstetrician or a gynecologist in over 2 years. I aligned the pages so the edges were perfectly parallel. In the exact center of the desk, I placed the absolute crown jewel of my legal arsenal: the executed purchase and sale agreement for the Oak Ridge commercial complex. The binding document Heather had eagerly signed just hours ago, legally transferring a stolen $2 million asset to Apex Holdings, completely unaware she was selling it directly back to the very man she stole it from. Her verified digital signature glowed on the freshly printed page, the undeniable concrete proof of federal wire fraud. Finally, on the far right side, I placed the printed transcript of the extortion voicemail she had left me, alongside the financial logs showing her brother Travis laundering $500,000 through offshore Cayman Island accounts and buying luxury fishing boats in Florida. I sat back in my chair and looked at the spread. It was a flawless, lethal collection of hard facts. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, the family court judge would convene a hearing to determine if the temporary no-contact order should be made permanent and to rule on Heather's emergency motion to liquidate my commercial complex. She was walking into that courthouse expecting a sympathetic rubber stamp from a judge easily swayed by a weeping pregnant woman. She was expecting a swift, unchallenged victory. I was preparing a slaughterhouse. The stillness in my study was not the silence of fear or hesitation. It was the terrifying, patient stillness of an apex hunter waiting for the prey to step blindly into the clearing. I poured myself 2 fingers of straight-aged bourbon, stood up from the heavy desk, and walked over to the fireplace mantel. Above the stone hearth hung a beautifully framed oil portrait of my late wife, Cynthia. She passed away 7 years ago, long before Kendrick ever met Heather. Cynthia was the absolute grace to my relentless grit. When I came home with bleeding knuckles and a foul temper from fighting racist site managers in the 80s, she would sit me down at the kitchen table, clean my wounds with a steady hand, and remind me exactly why we were fighting so hard. She always believed the best in people. She believed our son was destined for absolute greatness because he possessed my intense drive and her boundless compassion. I looked deeply into her painted eyes and felt a tight, painful knot form in my throat. I raised my crystal glass to the portrait. "I am sorry, Cynthia," I whispered to the empty, quiet room. "I am so deeply sorry for what I have to do tomorrow morning. You asked me to protect this family, to secure our hard-earned legacy, and to always look after our boy. But the boy we raised is completely gone. He traded the strong spine we gave him for the pathetic illusion of an easy, subsidized life." I took a slow sip of the bourbon, letting the harsh burn ground my racing thoughts. I knew Cynthia would hate the public spectacle. She would absolutely despise seeing our proud family name dragged into a messy, vicious courtroom fight. But she would also recognize the grim necessity of amputation. When a deadly disease threatens to stop the heart, you cannot hesitate to cut off the infected limb. Kendrick had chosen his allegiance. He had chosen to assist a manipulative woman who wanted to destroy the very foundation we sacrificed our youth to build. Tomorrow I had to walk into a court of law and systematically dismantle my own son's entire future. I had to let him fall directly into the financial ruin and severe criminal jeopardy he willingly helped orchestrate. I had to do it to save the dignity and the integrity of the Ellis name. It was the heaviest, most unnatural burden a father could ever bear, but I would not flinch. I made a silent, unbreakable promise to my wife right there in the dark. I will clean up this massive mess. I will aggressively protect what we built, even if it means I have to stand completely alone at the end of it all. The sharp, sudden ringing of my cell phone broke the quiet intimacy of the moment. I glanced at the large clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. Only one person would be calling me at this specific hour. I walked back to the desk, set my glass down, and picked up the phone. Jonathan Pierce was on the other end, and his voice lacked the triumphant predatory edge it had possessed earlier that afternoon. The tone was strictly business-hardened, alert, and deeply serious. "Gordon, we have a massive tactical shift on the board," Jonathan said, his words coming in a rapid, stressed clip. "I just received the updated docket filing from the county court clerk. Heather fired her initial family lawyer 3 hours ago. She took the last remaining liquid funds she could access and placed a massive cash retainer on a new lead attorney. She just officially retained Valerie Carmichael." I recognized the name immediately. Anyone who followed high-stakes legal news in the state of Georgia knew that exact name. Valerie Carmichael was not a standard run-of-the-mill family court lawyer. She was a media-savvy, high-profile litigator who exclusively represented women in explosive domestic abuse and highly publicized divorce cases. She was notoriously ruthless, incredibly intelligent, and an absolute master at manipulating judicial sympathy and public perception. She did not just argue the strict confines of the law. She put the opposing party on trial in the ruthless court of public opinion, painting them as systemic violent abusers and leveraging every ounce of societal bias to secure massive, crippling settlements for her clients. She is a true white pointer shark, Gordon. Jonathan continued, pacing heavily on his end of the line. Carmichael does not take cases to settle them quietly behind closed doors. She takes cases to completely destroy the opposition publicly and aggressively. She is going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning and use your massive wealth, your race, and your imposing physical stature directly against you. She is going to legally frame Heather as a terrified, battered victim fighting a tyrannical, untouchable billionaire. This changes the entire dynamic of the hearing. We are not just fighting a greedy, desperate daughter-in-law anymore. We are fighting a master legal manipulator with a massive megaphone and a flawless track record. There will be absolutely no room for mercy tomorrow. One single mistake, one momentary emotional outburst from you on the stand, and she will hang us with it in front of the judge. I stared down at the neatly organized piles of hard evidence resting on my desk. I thought about the fake silicone belly, the offshore wire transfers to Miami, and the forged commercial loan documents. A cold, predatory smile crept slowly across my face. I picked up my bourbon and took one final sip. "Let her bring the shark, Jonathan," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. Because when Valerie Carmichael realizes her poor battered client is a federal fraudster wearing a rubber prop, she is going to chew her own client to pieces just to save her precious legal career. Get some sleep, Jonathan. Tomorrow we go to war. The heavy double doors of the county family courthouse felt like the gates to a modern coliseum. I walked through them precisely at 8:45 in the morning, my posture perfectly rigid and my expression completely unreadable. I wore a charcoal gray tailored suit, a crisp white shirt, and a muted burgundy tie. I dressed not to appease the court, but to demonstrate absolute, unyielding discipline for the battle about to take place. Jonathan Pierce walked smoothly beside me, his demeanor relaxed and predatory. He carried a single thick black leather briefcase. That briefcase held the explosive charges we were about to detonate directly under the foundation of my daughter-in-law's world. We took our seats at the respondents' table just as the bailiff called the room to order. Judge Alistair Thorne entered and took his place behind the high mahogany bench. He was a stern, gray-haired man with sharp eyes that peered scrutinizingly over the rim of his reading glasses. He was widely respected in the legal community for fiercely protecting vulnerable dependents, but he was equally known for running a strict, no-nonsense courtroom. He demanded order, and he had a very low tolerance for any form of domestic tyranny. A moment later, the side doors opened and the opposition made their entrance. Valerie Carmichael walked in first, wearing a pristine white suit that made her look like a shark cutting through clear water. Right behind her was Heather. The transformation was startling. The woman who usually paraded around in designer clothes and heavy makeup was completely gone. She wore an oversized, faded maternity dress that looked 2 sizes too big, making her appear small and fragile. Her hair was unwashed and pulled into a messy, frantic bun. She wore absolutely no makeup, leaving her skin looking pale and sickly. Her arms were wrapped defensively around her pronounced, rounded belly. She looked like the ultimate picture of a battered, terrified victim. Kendrick trailed several paces behind her. My son wore a wrinkled suit, his shoulders slumped forward. He refused to look in my direction. He kept his eyes firmly glued to the scuffed linoleum floor, the very picture of a broken, submissive captive. Valerie Carmichael wasted absolutely no time setting the stage. She called her client to the witness stand immediately. Heather did not walk to the wooden box. She shuffled. She kept her head slightly bowed, wincing slightly as she sat down, protectively cupping her midsection. Carmichael approached the podium with a soft maternal smile, contrasting sharply with the aggressive reputation she held outside these walls. For the next 40 minutes, I sat perfectly still and watched a theatrical performance worthy of an Academy Award. Carmichael asked leading, deeply emotional questions, and Heather delivered every response with flawless execution. Her voice trembled at the exact right moments. She paused, took shaky breaths, and wiped away invisible tears from her pale cheeks. She painted a horrifying picture of a megalomaniacal billionaire who used his immense wealth to keep his entire family trapped in a financial and emotional prison. She claimed I tracked her every movement, that I demanded daily accounting of her expenses, and that I verbally berated Kendrick in front of her to assert my total dominance over their household. But her true masterpiece was how she twisted my strict adherence to the judge's own restraining order into a weapon of attempted murder. Heather looked directly at Judge Thorne, her lower lip quivering violently. She testified that the moment she sought legal protection for her unborn baby, I retaliated with terrifying, unchecked malice. She described how she went to the pharmacy to pick up essential prenatal vitamins only to find her health insurance maliciously canceled. She cried as she recounted receiving a repossession notice for her vehicle, claiming I was intentionally trying to strand a high-risk pregnant woman without any access to emergency medical care. She turned her tear-filled eyes toward Kendrick, who was sitting at the petitioner's table, staring blankly at his own hands. She told the court that I had mentally destroyed my own son. She claimed Kendrick was a hostage trapped between a father who threatened to leave him destitute and a wife who just wanted a safe environment for their child. The gallery behind me, filled with law clerks, waiting attorneys, and curious onlookers, began to murmur. I could feel the heavy, judgmental stares burning into the back of my neck. The atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. Public opinion was solidly against me. In their eyes, I was a wealthy, powerful, and vindictive man, using my resources to crush a fragile, defenseless mother-to-be. Carmichael paced slowly in front of the jury box, raising her voice just enough to fill the cavernous room with righteous indignation. She argued that the temporary no-contact order was insufficient to protect her client from a man with my level of vast, unchecked resources. She formally requested that the order be made permanent and unconditional. Then she moved to her ultimate prize. She pleaded with the court to grant her emergency motion, allowing the immediate sale of the Oak Ridge Commercial Complex to Apex Holdings. She argued that the $2 million cash sale was the only way to sever the toxic financial umbilical cord I had wrapped around her client's neck. She claimed the money was required immediately to secure safe, independent housing and pay for the specialized medical care her highly stressed, at-risk pregnancy desperately needed. She rested her direct examination, leaving a heavy, sympathetic silence hovering over the courtroom. Judge Thorne leaned back in his high leather chair. He removed his reading glasses, letting them drop against his black robes. He looked down at Heather with a softening gaze, radiating the exact kind of paternal sympathy Carmichael had banked on securing. Then his eyes shifted to me. The warmth vanished instantly from his face. In its place was a look of profound, deeply ingrained judicial disgust. Mr. Ellis, Judge Thorne began, his voice echoing loudly through the microphones. This court has a fundamental, unwavering duty to protect vulnerable dependents and unborn children from any form of violence, be it physical, emotional, or financial. What has been described here today is a textbook pattern of systemic coercive control and retaliatory financial starvation. Depriving a pregnant woman of her health insurance and transportation as punishment for seeking a lawful protective order is not merely vindictive. It is dangerously close to criminal endangerment. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel, turning it slowly in his hands. Based on the compelling and deeply troubling testimony provided by the petitioner and considering the absolute necessity to secure emergency medical housing funds for the mother, this court is heavily inclined to grant the permanent protective order. Furthermore, I find the motion to liquidate the Oak Ridge commercial property to be a reasonable, necessary, and urgent step to sever these toxic financial ties once and for all. Heather lowered her head, hiding a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk of absolute triumph. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully manipulated a seasoned judge and legally robbed me of a $2 million asset right in front of my face. Valerie Carmichael stood tall at her table, snapping her files shut with a smug, satisfied finality. Before Judge Thorne could raise his gavel to strike the wooden block and make the catastrophic ruling official movement caught his eye, Jonathan Pierce slowly pushed his chair back. He stood up to his full height, his movements deliberate, unhurried, and completely devoid of panic. He buttoned his suit jacket with a chilling calmness. The entire courtroom fell dead silent. He picked up his black leather briefcase, walked smoothly toward the center podium, and looked directly up at the bench. "Your Honor," Jonathan said, his voice ringing out sharp, clear, and perfectly steady. "Before the court finalizes a permanent order and authorizes the liquidation of a commercial asset, the respondent respectfully requests the opportunity to cross-examine the witness. We also have several pieces of physical evidence to enter into the official record. Evidence that will demonstrate to this court that the petitioner is not a victim of financial abuse but the architect of a massive, multi-tiered federal fraud." Judge Thorne stared down at Jonathan from his high mahogany bench. His heavy wooden gavel remained suspended in the air, halting the final ruling that would have stripped me of my property. In family court proceedings, judges are highly protective of their courtrooms and generally despise surprise tactics, but Jonathan Pierce commanded a specific, undeniable kind of respect. Judge Thorne slowly lowered the wooden mallet, resting it carefully on the sounding block. "You may proceed." "Counselor," the judge stated, his voice echoing loudly through the microphone. "But this had better be directly relevant to the protective order and the emergency liquidation motion currently sitting on my desk." Jonathan inclined his head with perfect, practiced respect. "It is the very heart of the matter, Your Honor." Jonathan turned away from the bench and walked deliberately toward the center of the room. He did not soften his voice. He did not adopt the gentle, comforting tone Valerie Carmichael had used to coddle her client. He approached the witness stand with the cold, mechanical precision of a surgeon holding a freshly sharpened scalpel. "Mrs. Ellis," Jonathan began, his voice ringing sharply off the polished, wood-paneled walls. "You just sat before this court and provided a very moving, deeply emotional testimony under penalty of perjury. You explicitly stated that my client Gordon Ellis has engaged in a campaign of severe financial starvation. You claimed under oath that you have been left completely destitute, entirely incapable of paying for basic medical care or securing safe housing for your growing family. Is that an accurate summary of your sworn testimony here today?" Heather sniffled, dabbing her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue she had been clutching for the past hour. She nodded slowly, keeping her chin tucked down to project absolute vulnerability. "Yes. He cut us off from everything. We have absolutely nothing left to our names." Jonathan stopped pacing. He stood directly in front of the wooden witness box, planting his feet firmly on the carpet. Then can you please explain to this court why exactly 3 weeks ago a home equity line of credit for $500,000 was fully dispersed into a joint checking account where you are listed as the primary account holder? A sudden collective gasp rippled through the gallery behind me. Valerie Carmichael bolted upright from her leather chair, her pristine white suit flashing under the fluorescent lights. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. Opposing counsel is attempting to ambush my client with unverified financial claims that have absolutely no bearing on her physical safety or the necessity of this protective order. Judge Thorne held up his hand, his sharp eyes narrowing as he looked critically at Jonathan. I will allow it, counselor, but you need to tread very carefully. Overruled, the witness will answer the pending question. Heather shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her knuckles turned white as her fingers tightened their grip on the fabric of her oversized maternity dress. I do not know what you are talking about. Kendrick handles all of the business loans for the commercial complex. If there was a sudden loan, Kendrick must have asked his father for it to help with our daily living expenses. Jonathan did not miss a single beat. He reached into his open briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of printed banking records. Let the official record reflect that I am handing the witness Exhibit A. Mrs. Ellis, these are the verified certified bank statements for your personal joint checking account. They show a direct deposit of $500,000 from a private lending institution. They also show that less than 48 hours after that massive deposit cleared, the funds were systematically wired out of the country in aggressive increments of exactly $9,900. Did Kendrick execute those offshore wire transfers to your brother Travis Belmont in Miami and the Cayman Islands? Heather's pale, carefully powdered complexion suddenly flushed with a deep, panicked red. Her eyes darted wildly toward Valerie Carmichael, silently begging for a legal lifeline. Carmichael stood up again, her voice raising in volume. Objection, badgering the witness. My client is a vulnerable pregnant woman dealing with extreme stress, not a forensic accountant managing corporate ledgers. Judge Thorne leaned forward over his bench, his judicial curiosity now fully engaged. The paternal sympathy was rapidly draining from his weathered face, replaced by the sharp analytical instincts of a veteran magistrate smelling a lie. Sit down, Ms. Carmichael. The objection is firmly overruled. Answer the question, Mrs. Ellis. Did you or did you not authorize those specific offshore wire transfers? Heather stammered, her voice completely losing its previously perfect theatrical tremble. I was just trying to help my family. My brother was in terrible trouble with bad people. Kendrick and I agreed we needed to secure our future because Gordon was becoming so erratic and dangerous. The money was a perfectly legal loan against the commercial property Kendrick manages. Jonathan smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory expression. A legal loan. Let us examine that legality closely. He pulled another crisp document from his briefcase. Your Honor, I am submitting Exhibit B. This is the original digital promissory note for the $500,000 line of credit. As this court is well aware, the Oak Ridge Commercial Complex is held in a private trust solely owned and exclusively controlled by my client, Gordon Ellis. Kendrick Ellis is merely an employee acting as a property manager. He has absolutely no legal or fiduciary authority to encumber the asset. Jonathan handed the document to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge and then handed a duplicate copy to Heather. Mrs. Ellis, I direct your attention to the bottom of the final page. There is a digital signature there authorizing the $500,000 lien against the commercial property. It is the signature of Gordon Ellis. Did you personally witness my client sign this binding legal document? Heather swallowed hard. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, her chest heaving under the fabric of her dress. Yes. He signed it digitally on the computer. He told us we could use the money to prepare for the baby and help my brother. Jonathan turned his back to her and faced the judge directly. Your Honor, Exhibit C is a comprehensive forensic analysis conducted by a board-certified digital document examiner. That sworn report conclusively proves that the signature on the promissory note is a complete digital forgery. The Internet Protocol address used to access the private lending portal and execute the signature did not originate from my client's primary residence or his corporate office. The IP address belongs to the primary desktop computer located inside the private home of Kendrick and Heather Ellis. Furthermore, my client's physical passport and original Social Security card, which were strictly required for secondary identity verification, were reported stolen from his private wall safe just days prior to this loan being finalized. Carmichael slammed her hands down hard on the petitioner table, sending a pen clattering to the floor. Your Honor, this is absolutely outrageous. Even if this highly circumstantial digital evidence is accurate, there are two adult individuals living in that house. Opposing counsel is baselessly accusing my client of massive fraud, when her husband, the respondent's own son, had equal access to the computer and the safe combinations. Jonathan pivoted back to the witness stand, his eyes locking onto Heather with the searing intensity of a sniper looking through a scope. "Let us address technical capability, Your Honor. Mrs. Ellis, before you married my client's son, what was your primary profession in the financial sector?" Heather glared at him, her jaw locked completely tight. "I worked in banking." Jonathan raised his voice, ensuring every single person sitting in the gallery could hear him clearly. "You were not just a bank teller, Mrs. Ellis. You were a senior commercial loan officer for 5 consecutive years. You were specifically and rigorously trained in commercial underwriting, complex title encumbrances, and digital notary portals. You know exactly which private hard money lenders prioritize rapid disbursement over rigorous due diligence. You possess the highly specialized granular knowledge required to bypass standard banking security protocols and push a fraudulent $500,000 commercial loan through a digital portal without raising internal flags." Jonathan pointed a long, accusatory finger directly at Kendrick, who was actively shrinking down into his wooden chair at the petitioner table. "My client's son, Kendrick Ellis, relies entirely on his father to negotiate his basic car insurance rates. He does not know what an offshore routing number is, and he certainly does not know how to intentionally structure a smurfing operation to systematically bypass federal anti-money laundering reporting thresholds. You do. You stole the confidential documents. You forged the signature. You secured the illicit funds. And then when you realized the bank might eventually audit the file and catch the anomaly, you rushed directly to this court and filed a fake domestic violence restraining order to legally paralyze my client before he could discover the massive theft." The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the air conditioning unit humming steadily through the ceiling vents. The narrative Valerie Carmichael had so carefully constructed over the past hour was being brutally dismantled in real time. The fragile, helpless victim was evaporating into thin air, and the harsh image of a calculating high-level fraudster was rapidly taking her place. Judge Thorne looked down at Heather. His expression was cold, rigid, and deeply furious. "Mrs. Ellis, these are extremely severe allegations of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery. How do you respond to this documentary evidence presented before this court?" Heather felt the heavy walls of the courtroom closing in and crushing her lungs. She looked up at the judge, then over at her aggressive attorney, who was furiously flipping through her own legal pads trying to find a viable defense. Heather realized her pristine legal shield was completely shattered. She fell back on the very last weapon she had in her arsenal: pure emotion. She erupted into hysterical, hyperventilating sobs. It was not a calculated, quiet performance this time. It was the raw, ugly panic of a cornered animal realizing the steel trap had finally sprung. She clutched her oversized maternity dress, wrapping both arms tightly and protectively around her pronounced belly. She rocked back and forth in the wooden witness chair, wailing loudly into the microphone. "He forced me into this," she screamed, pointing a trembling, desperate finger directly at me sitting quietly at the defense table. "Gordon is a monster. He starves us financially. He controls every single breath we take in that house. You do not understand what it is like living under his heavy thumb. We were desperate. We had absolutely nothing to our names. I was terrified he was going to kick us out onto the street and leave us to die in the gutter. Yes, I got the loan. Yes, I moved the money to save my brother. I had to do it. I had to protect my family from him." She looked up at Judge Thorne, her face flushed dark red and streaked with genuine tears of pure, unadulterated terror. "I did it for my baby. I did what any good mother would do to protect her unborn child from a vicious, abusive tyrant. You have to believe me, Your Honor. Everything I did to save the precious life of my baby." The gallery held its collective breath. It was the ultimate, undeniable emotional trump card. A weeping mother publicly confessing to a severe financial crime but justifying it entirely under the sacred, untouchable banner of maternal survival. In family court, a sympathetic judge will often forgive a massive mountain of financial indiscretions if they truly believe an innocent child's safety is at immediate risk. Valerie Carmichael stood up slowly, her confidence briefly returning as she prepared to capitalize on her client's desperate emotional plea for judicial mercy. Jonathan Pierce did not object to the outburst. He did not raise his voice to interrupt her. He did not look up at the judge for a ruling. He simply reached over to his black leather briefcase and pulled out the final thick gray folder my private investigator had provided. He closed the heavy brass latches of his briefcase with a sharp, echoing snap that rang through the room like a gunshot. He looked up at Heather. His face was completely devoid of human sympathy. He smiled. It was a slow, terrifying smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "Excellent, Mrs. Ellis," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling register that carried perfectly through the silent room. "Then let us talk about the baby." Jonathan walked back to our table and retrieved a slender manila envelope. The entire courtroom was hanging on his every word. Even Judge Thorne leaned forward, his heavy gavel completely forgotten on the sounding block. Jonathan turned back to the witness stand, holding the envelope loosely in his left hand. "Mrs. Ellis, you have invoked the safety and well-being of your unborn child multiple times today," Jonathan said, his voice entirely devoid of the aggressive volume he had used just moments ago. He was speaking softly now, which made the atmosphere in the room feel incredibly dangerous. "You testified that my client maliciously canceled your health insurance to prevent you from receiving vital prenatal care. Could you please tell the court the name of your primary obstetrician?" Heather blinked. The sudden shift in Jonathan's line of questioning caught her completely off guard. She tightened her arms around her stomach, her eyes darting nervously toward Valerie Carmichael. "I go to the Atlanta Women's Clinic," she stammered. "I see several different doctors there. They rotate." Jonathan nodded slowly, as if he completely believed her. He opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper with a heavy, embossed seal at the top. "Your Honor, I am submitting Exhibit D. This is a lawfully executed medical subpoena response directly from the Atlanta Women's Clinic, signed under penalty of perjury by their Chief Medical Records Officer. It conclusively states that Heather Ellis is not a patient at their facility. In fact, she has not been treated at any of their affiliated branches in over 2 years." Valerie Carmichael stood up, her face a mask of furious indignation. "Your Honor, this is a flagrant violation of my client's medical privacy. Opposing counsel is launching a baseless fishing expedition. Women often change clinics during pregnancy, especially when fleeing financial abuse." Jonathan did not even look at Carmichael. He kept his eyes locked firmly on Heather. "Then perhaps Mrs. Ellis can explain Exhibit E," Jonathan said, pulling a high-resolution photograph from the envelope. He walked it over to the bench, then handed a copy to Carmichael, and finally placed a copy on the wooden ledge directly in front of Heather. "This is the exact ultrasound image you posted on your public social media accounts 3 weeks ago," Jonathan announced, turning to face the gallery. "The very same image you used to garner public sympathy and accuse my client of endangering your child. Your Honor, attached to that photograph is a verified reverse image search report conducted by a licensed digital investigator. That ultrasound belongs to a medical stock photography database. It was purchased online for $29.99 using a debit card registered to Heather Ellis." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic wave of gasps and frantic whispers. The gallery, which had been glaring daggers at me just an hour ago, was now staring at Heather in absolute, unadulterated horror. Judge Thorne slammed his gavel down against the block. The sharp cracking sound echoed like a gunshot. "Silence in my courtroom," he roared, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. Carmichael was staring at the stock photo watermark on the ultrasound printout. Her jaw was physically clenched. She was a ruthless, brilliant attorney, and she suddenly realized she had been completely played by her own client. She looked at Heather, her eyes wide with a mixture of betrayal and professional panic. But Jonathan was not finished. He stepped right up to the edge of the witness box. He pulled one final document from the envelope. It was a simple printed commercial invoice. "Mrs. Ellis," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. "When you applied for the fraudulent $500,000 loan, you claimed you were in your second trimester. When you filed the emergency restraining order, you claimed the stress was threatening the pregnancy. Yet we have proven you have no medical records and your ultrasound is a purchased stock image. So I must ask you to explain Exhibit F to this court." Jonathan handed the paper to the judge, who snatched it from his hand. "This is a verified shipping and purchase invoice from a specialty theatrical effects company located in Burbank, California," Jonathan declared, his voice carrying to the very back row of the gallery. "The invoice is billed to Heather Ellis. The item purchased and shipped to her private residence is described as a custom-matched medical-grade silicone prosthetic belly, specifically designed for film and television productions to mimic a 5-month human pregnancy." Absolute pandemonium broke out. Several people in the gallery stood up. A court reporter covered her mouth with her hands. Judge Thorne dropped the paper onto his desk, his face a portrait of sheer unprecedented judicial fury. He stared down at Heather as if he were looking at a monster. There was no child. There was never a child. The woman sitting on the stand weeping for the safety of her baby was strapping a piece of synthetic rubber to her waist every single morning. I slowly turned my head to look at Kendrick. My son was sitting at the petitioner's table, completely frozen. All the blood had drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He was staring at Heather's stomach. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with a horrifying, crushing realization. When Kendrick stood on my porch in the freezing rain and confessed to opening my safe, he claimed he did it because Heather threatened to take away his unborn child. He had compromised his morals, betrayed his own father, and risked a massive federal prison sentence to protect a baby he believed was his ultimate responsibility. He had rationalized his cowardice by convincing himself he was being a good father. Now the devastating truth was washing over him like acid. There was no baby. The entire foundation of his betrayal was a theatrical prop bought on the internet. He had thrown away his family legacy, his financial security, and his father's love for a piece of molded silicone. He physically slumped forward in his chair. His chest caved in as he gasped for air, looking like a man who had just been gutted alive. He placed his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently, but he made no sound. He was completely and utterly broken. On the witness stand, Heather's pristine facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. The oversized, faded maternity dress no longer made her look like a sympathetic victim. It made her look like a deranged, pathological fraud. She was completely exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The protective shield of societal bias she had expertly weaponized had evaporated. She looked frantically around the room, making eye contact with the disgusted faces in the gallery, the furious glare of the judge, and the absolute revulsion radiating from her own attorney. Survival is the only instinct a predator truly knows. When a rat is trapped in a burning building, it will chew through its own kind to escape the flames. Heather realized her victim narrative was dead. The fraud was undeniably proven. So she did the only thing she had left. She pivoted violently, desperately trying to construct a brand new lie. She stood up in the witness box, pointing a shaking, manic finger directly at my son. It was him, she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceiling. It was Kendrick. He made me do it. I did not want to do this. He bought the belly. He forced me to wear it. He said his father was too stingy, and the only way to get the commercial building was to make him look like an abuser. Kendrick orchestrated the whole thing. He is the one who stole the documents from the safe. He is the one who forged the signature. I am just his wife. He forced me to go along with it. The sheer audacity of her lie jolted Kendrick out of his silent collapse. The man who had spent his entire marriage bowing his head and taking orders suddenly snapped. His head shot up, his eyes blazing with a mixture of profound grief and sudden, explosive rage. He pushed his heavy wooden chair back so hard it screeched against the floor. He planted his hands on the table, preparing to stand up. He was opening his mouth, filling his lungs to scream back at her, to defend himself, to unleash all the suppressed anger he had buried for years. I did not speak. I did not raise my hand. I simply turned my body slightly and locked eyes with my son across the courtroom. Kendrick caught my gaze. All the screaming fury in his chest died instantly. He looked into my eyes and saw the cold, unyielding discipline I had tried to instill in him his entire life. My stare was absolute. It carried a silent, undeniable command. Do not speak. Do not engage. Let her dig the grave. Kendrick swallowed hard. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a sudden, fearful obedience. He slowly lowered himself back into his wooden chair, pressing his lips tightly together. He sat perfectly still, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table, completely surrendering to my silent authority. Heather was still screaming from the witness stand, frantically spinning her web of lies, but nobody was listening to her anymore. The trap had closed, and the final nail was about to be hammered directly into the coffin. Jonathan stood completely unfazed by Heather's hysterical outburst. He let her screams echo and die out in the cavernous room before he finally spoke again. He did not raise his voice to compete with her panic. He simply waited for the silence to return, wielding it like a heavy weapon. Your Honor, Jonathan said, his voice slicing through the remaining tension with surgical precision. The respondent would like to submit one final piece of evidence. Exhibit G. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, legally bound document. The crisp white paper seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. He walked it up to the judge's bench, handed a duplicate copy to the petitioner's table, and held the final copy directly in front of Heather. She stopped hyperventilating just long enough to look down at it. Her eyes widened in immediate recognition. It was the formal purchase and sale agreement for the Oak Ridge Commercial Complex. The exact contract she had aggressively expedited and digitally signed just yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Ellis, Jonathan began pacing slowly back toward the center of the room. Yesterday you executed a binding legal contract to sell the Oak Ridge Commercial Complex for $2 million in cash. You pushed your broker for a highly expedited 7-day closing period, completely waiving all standard commercial inspections, environmental studies, and financial contingencies. You were in a massive rush. In this document, right above your verified electronic signature, there is a standard seller's attestation clause. Jonathan stopped and looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, by signing this specific document, the petitioner swore under penalty of perjury that she had the unencumbered legal right and full authority to convey this property. She formally declared to the buyer that she was the rightful, undisputed owner. Mrs. Ellis, did you sign this contract? Heather looked frantically at Valerie Carmichael, but her attorney was staring at the document like it was coated in radioactive poison. Heather looked back at Jonathan, her voice a fragile, shaky whisper. I had to do it. I needed the money to survive. The buyer made an all-cash offer and I accepted it to get far away from Gordon. He left me no other choice. Jonathan nodded slowly, a predatory gleam in his eye. You accepted an unsolicited offer from a Delaware-based corporate entity named Apex Holdings, LLC. You transmitted this signed fraudulent contract across state lines using a verified electronic portal. You intended to route the $2 million proceeds directly into a private escrow account under your sole control, bypassing my client and your husband entirely. Heather lifted her chin, a tiny, desperate flicker of defiance returning to her eyes. It is a valid sale. The buyer wants the property. They offered the money, and I signed the papers. Jonathan let out a short, humorless laugh that echoed through the silent courtroom. It is a valid contract, Mrs. Ellis. But the transaction is far from a standard real estate deal. He turned back to the judge. Your Honor, as you know, Delaware corporate law allows the true owners of an LLC to remain entirely anonymous behind registered agents. It is designed to protect financial privacy. However, as an officer of the court, I am now legally compelled to reveal the primary benefactor and sole funding source of Apex Holdings, LLC. Jonathan turned slowly on his heels and pointed a long, steady finger directly at me. The sole owner of Apex Holdings is my client, Gordon Ellis. A collective gasp ripped through the gallery behind me. Even Judge Thorne sat back heavily in his high leather chair, his eyebrows raised in profound, unadulterated shock. Heather's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at me, then at Jonathan, her brain struggling to process the catastrophic reality of what she had just heard. That is impossible, she whispered, her voice completely hollow, devoid of any theatrical tremble. They offered me $2 million. Jonathan stepped right up to the edge of the witness box, closing the physical distance between them, trapping her in his gaze. My client offered you $2 million of his own dollars to buy back his own stolen property. And you eagerly took the bait. You did not conduct a single background check. Your overwhelming greed blinded you to the most basic principles of commercial due diligence. You tried to sell a $2 million commercial complex that you stole via a forged power of attorney directly back to the very man you stole it from. Jonathan turned his back to her and addressed the judge, his voice booming with the terrifying weight of federal law. Your Honor, this is no longer a simple family court matter. By executing this fraudulent contract and transmitting it across state lines via an electronic digital portal to a Delaware corporation, the petitioner has officially escalated her crimes from state-level forgery to federal wire fraud. She willingly and intentionally engaged in a deceptive scheme to defraud an interstate entity out of $2 million. The gravity of those words hung heavily in the air. Federal wire fraud. It is not a charge that gets brushed away with a slap on the wrist, a tearful apology, or a sympathetic family court ruling. It triggers automatic investigations by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Department of Justice. It carries mandatory minimum prison sentences that stretch into decades. Heather had not just dug her own grave. She had poured the concrete over her own coffin and nailed the lid shut from the inside. She stared at me from across the room, her eyes wide with a horrific soul-crushing realization. I did not blink. I did not smile. I simply stared back at her with the cold, immovable presence of a man who had built his life on solid rock, watching her house of cards completely obliterate. "You set me up," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the ringing silence of the courtroom. "You trapped me." "You trapped yourself," Mrs. Ellis, Jonathan replied smoothly, walking back to our table. "We simply opened the door and watched you walk inside." The devastating finality of the situation finally reached the petitioner's table. Valerie Carmichael, the ruthless, high-profile litigator who had marched into this courtroom expecting to publicly eviscerate me, stood up slowly. Her face was a mask of cold, professional self-preservation. She did not look at Heather. She did not offer a single word of comfort to the woman she had vigorously defended just moments ago. She simply reached down and closed her thick legal binders with a sharp, definitive snap. She gathered her perfectly organized notes, placed them neatly inside her designer briefcase, and zipped it shut. "Your Honor," Carmichael said, her voice completely devoid of the passionate advocacy she had wielded earlier. "In light of the profound, incontrovertible evidence presented here today, evidence that completely contradicts the sworn statements provided to me by my client, I find myself in an ethically untenable position. I cannot in good conscience continue this representation without violating the strict codes of professional conduct." She looked up at Judge Thorne, her expression hardened and resolute. "I formally request to withdraw as counsel for the petitioner effective immediately." Judge Thorne looked at the formidable lawyer, then down at the utterly ruined woman trembling in the witness box. "Request to withdraw is granted, Ms. Carmichael. You are excused." Carmichael did not hesitate. She picked up her briefcase, turned her back on Heather, and walked smoothly out of the courtroom without a single backward glance. Heather watched her only remaining shield walk out the heavy wooden doors. She was left entirely alone, facing federal fraud charges without legal representation and trapped under the furious gaze of a judge she had actively tried to manipulate. Absolute, unadulterated panic set in. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind Valerie Carmichael, sealing Heather inside her own self, made purgatory. The sharp click of the brass latch echoed loudly, breaking the momentary paralysis of the courtroom. Then, absolute chaos erupted. The gallery behind me broke into a deafening chorus of shocked whispers and outraged murmurs. People were pointing directly at the witness stand. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenograph machine, struggling to capture the unprecedented collapse of a federal fraudster in real time. Judge Thorne slammed his wooden gavel repeatedly against the sounding block, his voice booming over the microphone, demanding immediate order in his court, but the sheer magnitude of the scandal made the room nearly uncontrollable. Heather stood entirely alone in the wooden witness box. The protective shield of her expensive attorney was gone. The fake maternity dress hung off her shoulders like a deflated parachute. She looked around with wild, manic eyes, realizing there was no legal loophole left to jump through, no sympathetic jury to manipulate, no settlement to negotiate. She was staring directly down the barrel of a federal indictment, and she was completely exposed. A cornered predator does not surrender quietly. It lashes out at the nearest, weakest target. Heather locked her furious, bloodshot eyes on my son. Kendrick was still sitting at the petitioner's table, his hands shaking violently against the polished wood. Heather leaned entirely over the wooden railing of the witness box, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She completely abandoned the soft, trembling voice of a battered victim. Her tone became a harsh, guttural scream that pierced the air like shattered glass. "You useless, pathetic coward," she shrieked, aiming her finger directly at Kendrick's chest. "Look at you. You cannot even stand up to your own father to defend your wife. You are the reason we are in this mess. If you were half a man, if you had the spine to demand what was rightfully yours, I would not have had to secure our future myself. I had to do the heavy lifting, because you are too weak to take what you deserve. You let him control you like a dog on a leash." Kendrick flinched as if he had been physically struck across the jaw. He looked up at the woman he had betrayed his own flesh and blood to protect. He was witnessing the absolute, unfiltered reality of his wife. She did not love him, not love. She despised his weakness. She had merely utilized his proximity to my wealth as a convenient stepping stone, and now that the bridge was collapsing, she was actively trying to drown him to save herself. Jonathan Pierce did not let her tirade hijack the narrative. He stood tall and addressed the bench with a commanding, authoritative projection that instantly cut through Heather's screaming. Your Honor, before this court temporarily adjourns to process the severe magnitude of these federal crimes, the respondent requests the submission of one final piece of digital evidence. Exhibit H. This evidence will permanently clarify the exact nature of the coercion in this household and definitively dismantle the petitioner's desperate claim that her husband orchestrated this fraud. Judge Thorne gripped his gavel, his eyes burning with judicial outrage. Proceed, counselor. Put it on the screen. Let us see the absolute bottom of this swamp. Jonathan signaled the court bailiff, who activated the large digital monitor mounted on the courtroom wall. Jonathan plugged a small silver flash drive into the court's media console. The large screen flickered to life. The courtroom plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence as the stark, high-definition infrared footage filled the display. The video showed the front porch of my estate in the dead of night. The torrential rain lashed violently across the screen, distorting the background into a chaotic blur of gray and black. Then a figure stumbled into the frame. It was Kendrick. He was drenched to the bone, his designer clothes plastered to his skin, his face twisted in absolute unfiltered terror. The high-sensitivity audio feed kicked in, sending the sound of the raging thunderstorm and Kendrick's frantic, heavy breathing echoing through the court speakers. Every person in the gallery leaned forward. Heather froze in the witness box, the color draining entirely from her face as she realized exactly what was about to play. On the screen, Kendrick collapsed against my heavy oak door, sliding down to the wet welcome mat. He looked directly up at the security camera lens. His voice cracked through the static, raw, broken, and utterly desperate. "Dad, I know you are there," the recorded Kendrick cried out. "I know you can hear me right now. She is completely out of her mind. Heather has lost her mind. I did not want to do it. I swear to God on my life I did not want to open your safe. She made me do it. She manipulated me." Heather's jaw dropped open. Her desperate lie about Kendrick forcing her to commit the fraud was currently being vaporized by Kendrick's own real-time confession. The recording continued, broadcasting my son's pathetic breakdown to the entire room. She told me her brother Travis was in deep trouble with some very dangerous people down in Florida, and he needed cash immediately to stay alive. She swore to me that we just needed to borrow the property documents to secure a temporary short-term loan. She packed a heavy suitcase and stood at the front door. She threatened to walk out of my life forever. She swore I would never lay eyes on my unborn child. She told me she would make sure I went to federal prison while she walked away with the money and the child. The audio played every single detail. It laid bare the emotional extortion, the manipulation of his paternal instincts regarding a baby that never even existed, and her aggressive push to sell the Oak Ridge commercial complex out from under us. Kendrick's digital ghost sobbed into the microphone, confirming that Heather was the undeniable singular mastermind of the entire operation. She was the one who researched the lenders. She was the one who forged my signature. She was the one who ruthlessly pushed for the immediate liquidation of my life's work. Jonathan stopped the video right as my voice came over the intercom on the recording, leaving the heavy, damning silence of the confession hanging in the courtroom air. He turned off the monitor and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, the defense rests." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The air felt incredibly dense, charged with the undeniable weight of pure, unadulterated truth. The gallery was motionless. The court reporter's hands rested quietly on her machine. Heather stood perfectly rigid in the witness box, completely stripped of her lies, her fake pregnancy, her attorney, and her defense. She had absolutely nowhere left to run. I had sat in my chair for the entire proceeding without making a single sound. I had let my attorney dismantle her structure brick by brick. Now the foundation was exposed, and it was time for me to speak. I stood up from the heavy wooden table. I buttoned my suit jacket and looked directly up at Judge Thorne. The judge met my gaze with profound, respectful attention. "Your Honor," I said, my voice deep, steady, and carrying the unyielding weight of 40 years of hard labor. "I built my entire life from the dirt up. When I started my company, I had nothing but split knuckles and a determination to forge a lasting legacy for my family name. Every single dollar, every piece of real estate, every asset attached to my name represents my blood, my sacrifice, and my sweat. I endured a lifetime of hardship so that my son would never have to know what it feels like to be broken by the world." I turned my head slightly, locking my eyes onto Heather, who visibly shrank back under my stare, and then onto Kendrick, who continued to stare at the floor in utter shame. "That is my sweat," I declared, my voice echoing like thunder in the silent room. "And I will not allow anyone, absolutely no one, to use my life's work as a playground for their boundless greed. No one has the right to steal it." Judge Thorne looked at me with a solemn, heavy nod of profound understanding. He looked down at his desk, disgusted by the sheer depravity of the individuals sitting at the petitioner's table. He picked up his wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack. "This court has heard enough," Judge Thorne announced, his voice radiating pure judicial authority. "I am ordering a strict 15-minute recess. During this time, no one involved in this matter is to leave this courtroom. The bailiffs will secure the exits. I will return shortly to deliver my final official ruling." The judge stood up, his black robes billowing behind him, and swiftly exited through his private chamber doors. The heavy doors clicked shut, trapping Heather and Kendrick in the inescapable prison of their own making. The 15 minutes felt like a suspended lifetime for the two people trapped at the petitioner table. The heavy wooden doors behind the bench finally swung open, and Judge Alistair Thorne strode back into the courtroom. His black robes billowed behind him, but it was his face that commanded the absolute attention of the room. The paternal sympathy he had displayed an hour earlier was completely eradicated. In its place was a mask of sheer, unadulterated judicial wrath. He sat down heavily in his high-leather chair and did not bother to organize his notes. He folded his hands tightly on the mahogany desk and fixed his piercing gaze directly on Heather. The courtroom was so quiet that the faint hum of the overhead lights sounded like a roaring engine. Judge Thorne picked up his wooden gavel and struck the sounding block once. It was a sharp, definitive crack that made Heather physically flinch in her seat. "This court handles the most sensitive, volatile, and dangerous matters of human existence," Judge Thorne began, his voice dropping to a low, booming register that echoed off the polished walls. "We deal with broken homes, shattered lives, and individuals who are in genuine, immediate physical danger. When a woman comes into this courthouse, swears under penalty of perjury that she is an abused, terrified victim, and claims that her unborn child is at risk, this system is designed to drop everything and throw an absolute shield around her. We issue emergency protective orders because we believe that the preservation of human life supersedes all other legal priorities." Judge Thorne leaned forward, his eyes boring into Heather like steel drills. "What you have done here today, Mrs. Ellis, goes far beyond simple financial greed. You have weaponized the very shield designed to protect battered women and turned it into a sword to execute a massive, calculated extortion scheme. You fabricated a pregnancy. You strapped a theatrical prop to your body and sat in that witness box, looking me directly in the eye, and wept fake tears to manipulate the authority of this court. You attempted to use the blind justice of this state as a blunt instrument to steal $2 million from a man you falsely accused of horrific crimes." Heather shrank back into her wooden chair. She wrapped her arms around the silicone belly, a pathetic, reflexive gesture that only highlighted the sheer absurdity of her deception. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some desperate plea for mercy, but the judge raised his hand, silencing her instantly. "Do not speak," Judge Thorne commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "You have completely forfeited your right to be heard in this room. Your sworn affidavit is a work of pure fiction. Your emergency motion to liquidate the commercial asset is summarily denied with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, the temporary no-contact order previously issued against Mr. Gordon Ellis is hereby immediately and permanently vacated. Mr. Ellis, you are entirely free from the unconstitutional restraints this court wrongfully placed upon you due to this woman's staggering deceit." I nodded respectfully toward the bench, keeping my face perfectly composed. The legal chains Heather had wrapped around my life were officially broken, shattered by the very judge she had tried to manipulate. But Judge Thorne was not finished. He turned his attention back to the center of the room. This court does not take lightly to being utilized as a pawn in a federal fraud syndicate. Perjury is a direct attack on the fundamental integrity of the judicial system. When you lie under oath, you do not just insult the judge. You insult every genuine victim who relies on this institution for survival. Judge Thorne looked past Heather and signaled directly to the two armed court bailiffs standing by the heavy wooden exit doors. "Bailiffs, take the petitioner into immediate custody," he ordered, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "She is to be held in the county lockup for direct criminal contempt of court and aggravated perjury." Furthermore, I am officially referring the transcripts of today's proceedings along with all digital and documentary evidence submitted by the respondent directly to the District Attorney and the United States Attorney's Office for the immediate pursuit of federal wire fraud and identity theft charges. The two large uniformed bailiffs moved with swift, practiced efficiency. They marched down the center aisle, their heavy boots thudding against the carpet. Heather's eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror. The reality of the judge's words finally crashed down upon her. She was not just losing the lawsuit, she was losing her freedom. "No," she shrieked, scrambling backward in the witness chair as the bailiffs approached. "No, you cannot do this. I am a victim. You do not understand. He manipulated everything." One of the bailiffs grabbed her firmly by the upper arm, hauling her out of the wooden box. The sudden jerky movement caused the oversized maternity dress to shift awkwardly. The thick strap of the silicone prosthetic belly slipped, exposing the synthetic rubber edge against her pale skin for the entire courtroom to see. It was the ultimate humiliating visual confirmation of her absolute depravity. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the bailiff ordered gruffly. Heather thrashed against his grip, her voice reaching a hysterical, deafening pitch. Kendrick, do something. Tell them to stop. Tell them you made me do it." Kendrick remained completely frozen in his chair at the petitioner table. He did not look at her. He stared blankly at the polished wood, completely paralyzed by the catastrophic implosion of his life. The metallic, heavy click of the steel handcuffs echoing through the courtroom was the sweetest sound I had heard in weeks. The bailiffs locked her wrists tightly together, securing her arms behind her back. Heather was sobbing uncontrollably now, her pristine facade completely destroyed. Realizing her husband was a lost cause, she desperately scanned the gallery behind the barrier. She was looking for her ultimate safety net. She was looking for her parents. "Mom, Dad, please help me," Heather screamed, her voice cracking with raw panic. "Call a lawyer. Do not let them take me." I turned my head slightly and looked toward the back rows of the gallery. Richard and Diane Belmont were standing up from the wooden benches. They did not look outraged. They did not look like concerned parents rushing to defend their wrongly accused daughter. They looked absolutely terrified. Richard Belmont's eyes locked onto mine across the crowded room. I did not break contact. I simply raised a single eyebrow. Richard knew exactly what that look meant. He knew that I possessed the audio recording of his arrogant phone call from yesterday morning. He knew that I had him on tape attempting to extort a $2 million commercial property in exchange for manipulating a judicial order. He knew that Griffin had documented every single dollar his son Travis had laundered through the Cayman Islands. Richard realized in that exact moment that the federal investigation Judge Thorne had just initiated would not stop with Heather. The FBI would follow the money trail. They would subpoena the offshore accounts, they would seize the luxury fishing boat in Miami, and they would listen to the extortion tapes. The entire Belmont family was standing on a trap door and the lever had just been pulled. Richard grabbed his wife tightly by the elbow. Diane was staring at her screaming daughter, her hand covering her mouth in shock. Richard did not hesitate. He yanked Diane violently toward the heavy wooden exit doors. They did not shout a word of comfort to Heather. They did not promise to call a bail bondsman. They put their heads down, pushed past the gathering crowd of stunned onlookers, and practically ran out of the courtroom, completely abandoning their daughter to save their own skin. Heather watched the heavy doors swing shut behind her parents. The absolute betrayal registered on her face, replacing her panicked screams with a hollow, breathless whimper. The people who taught her how to manipulate the people who had encouraged her to bleed my family dry had thrown her to the wolves the second they realized they were in danger. The bailiffs did not wait for her to recover. They gripped her arms and forcibly marched her down the center aisle. Her oversized dress dragged on the floor, the silicone belly jutting out absurdly as she was paraded past the gallery. The heavy side door opened and they dragged her into the holding cells, cutting off her final echoing sobs. The courtroom slowly began to clear. The gallery filed out, whispering furiously about the unprecedented spectacle they had just witnessed. Judge Thorne gathered his files and exited the bench, leaving the room entirely to the remaining family. Jonathan Pierce quietly snapped his black leather briefcase shut. He gave me a firm, respectful nod, understanding that his job was completely finished, and walked out the swinging doors to wait in the hallway. The silence returned, heavy and absolute. I stood up from my chair and slowly buttoned my suit jacket. I smoothed the lapels, feeling a profound, cold calm settle over my entire body. I turned my attention to the only other person left in the room, Kendrick was still sitting at the opposite table. The man who had allowed his wife to serve me with a fraudulent restraining order on my own front porch now looked incredibly small. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. His legs were shaking so badly he had to lean against the heavy mahogany table just to keep himself upright. He turned to face me. His eyes were completely bloodshot, swollen and overflowing with hot, continuous tears. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated devastation. He took a slow, shuffling step toward me. He looked like a small, lost boy searching for a safe harbor in the middle of a hurricane. The arrogance, the entitlement, the weak justifications were all completely gone. He took another step, closing the physical distance between us, desperately seeking the unconditional paternal forgiveness he had relied upon his entire life. "Dad." Kendrick whispered, his voice cracking a pitiful, broken sound that echoed in the empty courtroom. "Dad, I am so sorry." I stared at the tears streaming down his face. They were real tears born of genuine terror, but they moved nothing inside me. Kendrick took another trembling step forward, raising his hands as if he wanted to embrace me, as if a simple hug could erase the profound treachery of the past month. I did not step back, but my posture hardened into a wall of solid granite. He dropped his hands, realizing the physical distance between us was nothing compared to the emotional chasm he had dug. "Dad, please listen to me," Kendrick begged, his voice a frantic, breathless rush of words. "You have to believe me. I was completely brainwashed. She manipulated every single thought in my head. You saw the video. You heard her screaming at me just now. She is a psychopath. She controlled my finances, she isolated me from my friends, and she used that fake baby to hold me hostage in my own home. I swear I did not want to steal from you. She threatened to destroy my life if I did not give her the combination to your safe. I was a victim, Dad. I am a victim of her abuse." He was talking incredibly fast, desperately trying to rewrite history before the concrete dried. He was throwing the woman he had vowed to protect directly under the bus, stripping away his own agency to avoid accountability. "We can fix this," Kendrick continued, swiping a shaky hand across his wet face. "She is going to federal prison. We never have to see her again. We can go back to how things were. I will come work at the corporate office with you. I will do whatever you say. We can start over, just you and me. But I need your help, Dad." The bank sent the default notice for the $500,000 line of credit. Because she used our home address and our joint accounts, the bank is coming after me for the full balance. I do not have that kind of money. You know I do not have it. His voice broke into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "They are going to seize my house. They are going to garnish my wages forever. I will be completely bankrupt. But you have the money, Dad. You have millions. You can pay off that fraudulent loan with a single wire transfer and make this whole nightmare go away. Please, Dad, I am your only child. Save me from this. Pay the bank and let us just start over." I let his pathetic pleas hang in the stagnant air of the empty courtroom. I looked at his expensive tailored suit, the soft, unblemished skin of his hands, and the weak, quivering set of his jaw. He was a 35-year-old man begging for his allowance after actively participating in a plot to put me in a grave or a nursing home. "You are not sorry you betrayed me, Kendrick," I said. My voice was low, carrying the terrifying, immovable weight of absolute judgment. "You are only sorry that the woman you chose over me turned out to be a fraud, and you are sorry that you are now broke. You stand here and call yourself a victim. You claim she forced your hand. But I was the one standing on my own front porch while you watched a police officer hand me a fraudulent restraining order. You did not look like a hostage then. You looked like a man who had made his choice." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Kendrick instinctively shrank back. "You want me to write a $500,000 check to save your house?" I continued, the venom slowly seeping into my words. "You want me to use the wealth I built with my split knuckles and my broken back to shield you from the consequences of your own monumental cowardice. You stood by while she dragged my reputation through the mud. You opened my safe. You let her forge my signature. And now when the fire you helped start is burning your own house down, you run back to me expecting a bucket of water." I shook my head slowly, feeling the last remaining thread of my paternal affection snap completely. "I will not pay a single cent of that debt," I declared. "You let her secure that loan. You enjoyed the lifestyle it provided while you thought you were getting away with it. Now the bill has come due. You are going to lose that house. The bank will strip you down to your absolute foundation, and you are going to let them do it. You are going to use your own two hands to pay off every single dollar of that debt. You are going to learn what it actually means to survive in the real world without your father subsidizing your weakness." Kendrick let out a ragged, choking sob. He shook his head frantically. "Dad, please, I will not survive. I do not know how to rebuild from nothing. I am your son." I looked him dead in the eye, stripping away the final layer of his identity. A man who allows another person to step on his father's neck because he lacks the spine to fight back has no right to my legacy. The Ellis name was forged in fire, hardship, and unwavering loyalty. It does not harbor cowardice. You signed that loan with her. Use your own two hands to pay it off. You traded your birthright for a comfortable lie. As of this moment, you have no father, and I have no son." Kendrick's knees buckled. He collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor of the courtroom, crumbling like a poorly constructed building. He wrapped his arms around his own chest, wailing loudly into the empty, cavernous room. It was the sound of a man mourning the absolute, irreversible death of his entire universe. I did not reach down to help him up. I did not offer a final word of comfort. I turned my back on the pathetic figure weeping on the floor. I adjusted my suit jacket, squared my shoulders, and began to walk away. My leather dress shoes struck the hardwood floor with a heavy, rhythmic thud. Each step sounded like the ticking of a grandfather clock marking the end of an era. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom and stepped out into the long marble hallway. The heavy doors swung shut behind me with a loud, echoing snap cutting off Kendrick's desperate sobs. The hallway was completely empty. The cold fluorescent lights reflected off the polished marble tiles. I walked purposefully toward the exit, the sharp, authoritative click of my shoes echoing loudly in the quiet corridor. I did not look back. I kept my eyes fixed firmly ahead, walking away from the ruins of my family and stepping directly into the cold, harsh light of total isolation. 2 months is a remarkably short amount of time for a carefully constructed lie to completely evaporate, but the federal government moves with terrifying efficiency when presented with a perfectly packaged case of wire fraud. I sat in my home office reviewing the latest legal dossier Jonathan Pierce had hand-delivered that morning. The ripple effects of that explosive morning in family court had turned into a massive Category 5 legal hurricane. Heather was denied bail. She was deemed a severe flight risk due to her offshore connections and the sheer magnitude of her deception. She traded her designer maternity dresses for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit at the Federal Detention Center downtown. The United States Attorney offered her a plea deal, 10 years in federal prison with absolutely no possibility of early parole. If she fought it and went to trial, she was looking at a maximum of 25 years. The master manipulator was finally trapped in a cage where fake tears held absolutely no currency. The hammer did not just drop on Heather. The Federal Bureau of Investigation followed the digital breadcrumbs Griffin had so meticulously uncovered. They kicked down the door of her brother Travis in Miami. The feds seized the luxury center console fishing boat he had purchased with my stolen money. They froze his domestic accounts and worked with international authorities to lock down the Cayman Island shells. Travis was instantly bankrupted and currently facing a mountain of federal money laundering and wire fraud conspiracy charges. The illegal sports bookie he paid off vanished into thin air, leaving Travis to face the federal prosecutors completely alone. And then there were the parents, Richard and Diane Belmont, the arrogant couple who thought they could call a black man on a recorded line and extort him for a $2 million commercial property. Jonathan had gleefully forwarded that audio recording directly to the investigating federal agents. The Belmonts were currently the subjects of an aggressive, ongoing probe for conspiracy to commit extortion and accessory to financial fraud. Their bank accounts were heavily monitored. Their pristine reputation in the wealthy suburbs was entirely destroyed. Their country club memberships were suddenly and quietly revoked. They were social pariahs bleeding money on defense attorneys just to stay out of a federal indictment. I had systematically dismantled their entire bloodline without ever raising my voice or throwing a single punch. But the most profound transformation occurred much closer to home. The bank that issued the fraudulent $500,000 line of credit did not care about Kendrick's sob story. They did not care that he claimed his wife manipulated him or that he was an unwilling participant. They only cared that his name was legally tethered to a massive defaulted loan. The financial institution acted with swift and brutal corporate efficiency. They seized his suburban house. They repossessed his cars. They stripped him of every single luxury he had enjoyed on my dime. Kendrick was forced to learn the exact lesson I had tried to teach him for 35 years. He had to learn how to survive. Through my industry contacts, I kept a quiet, distant eye on him. I did not intervene. I did not offer a cushion. He was currently working as a basic day laborer at a commercial construction site 40 miles outside the city perimeter. It was a brutal non-union job, pouring concrete, hauling heavy steel rebar, and breaking his back under the relentless Georgia sun. The soft manicured hands that once signed away my legacy were now covered in thick calluses and burst blisters. His tailored suits were replaced by cheap, dirt-stained denim and heavy work boots. Every Friday when the site foreman handed him his weekly paycheck, the bank immediately garnished 75% of his wages to service the massive debt he had helped create. He was living in a rundown weekly motel, eating cheap canned food and waking up at 4 in the morning to catch a bus to the job site. He was finally experiencing the exact same grueling, bone-crushing reality I faced in 1982. He was learning that respect and survival are not inherited traits. They are earned through pain and unyielding endurance. I felt no joy watching him struggle. I felt no vindictive pleasure in his poverty. It was simply the brutal mechanics of the real world asserting themselves over a man who had chosen cowardice over integrity. He was finally paying his own way. I closed the legal dossier and placed it neatly on the corner of my mahogany desk. The operation was officially complete. The Oak Ridge commercial complex was firmly and uncontestedly back under my direct, unencumbered control. The threats to my estate were entirely neutralized. The parasites had been burned away. I stood up from my heavy leather chair and walked over to the large bay window overlooking my meticulously manicured front lawn. The house was perfectly clean. It was perfectly secure. And it was absolutely, undeniably silent. The quiet did not feel like the heavy, suffocating tension from 2 months ago. It was a vast, hollow emptiness. I looked up at the oil painting of my late wife Cynthia resting above the fireplace. I had kept my promise to her. I had protected the empire we built. I had defended the Ellis name against a coordinated attack designed to strip us down to the foundation. But victory in a war like this leaves no room for celebration. I had won the battle and secured the fortress, but I had permanently exiled my only child to do it. The cost of protecting my legacy was the total eradication of my family tree. I stood alone in a multi-million-dollar estate surrounded by the cold comfort of absolute power. I was a king sitting on a highly fortified throne entirely by myself. I picked up my keys from the entryway table and walked out into the crisp afternoon air. The heavy oak door of my home locked securely behind me with a solid, reassuring click. I climbed into my black SUV, the engine roaring to life with a deep, steady hum that perfectly mirrored my own internal rhythm. I drove through the bustling, sun-baked streets of Atlanta, the city sprawling out around me, completely indifferent to the massive structural collapse my family had just endured. I navigated the dense highway traffic with easy, practiced precision, heading directly toward the epicenter of the entire conflict, the Oak Ridge commercial complex. When I pulled through the front wrought iron gates of the property, the security guard recognized my vehicle immediately. He stood up straight in his booth, stepped out into the heat, and offered a sharp, deeply respectful nod. I parked in the reserved executive space right near the main glass entrance. For the past 3 years, that specific parking spot had been occupied by Kendrick's flashy imported sports car, a vehicle I paid for while he paraded around pretending to be a self-made mogul. Now the concrete was empty, waiting for its rightful owner. I stepped out of my vehicle and took a slow, deliberate walk across the sprawling commercial campus. The complex was operating in absolute perfect order. The high-end corporate tenants, the boutique medical clinics, and the technology startups occupying the glass and steel buildings were going about their daily business without a single disruption. During Kendrick's tenure as managing director, there were constant complaints from these professionals about delayed maintenance, ignored emails, and sloppy landscaping. In the 2 months since I officially retook direct administrative control, I had fired his lazy subcontractors and brought in my own trusted, hardworking crews. The heavy green hedges were sharply manicured. The concrete walkways were immaculate and swept clean. The glass facades gleamed brilliantly under the late afternoon sun. A senior partner from the law firm on the second floor walked past me offering a warm handshake and a word of gratitude for the recent upgrades to the lobby. Money, when wielded with strict, uncompromising discipline, is a force of pure stability. It builds impenetrable walls, it enforces necessary rules, and it commands undeniable respect. Kendrick and Heather had viewed this $2 million property merely as a giant piggy bank to smash open and loot for their own selfish, immediate desires. They did not respect the structural integrity of the asset. They only cared about the fast cash they could extract from its total destruction. Standing in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by the quiet, productive hum of commerce and industry, I felt a deep, resonant satisfaction. The ship had been violently steered toward a jagged, deadly reef, but I had violently seized the wheel and corrected the course just in time. The power of capital and the enforcement of absolute order had been successfully re-established. I walked into the main lobby of the Central Tower and took the private access elevator up to the top-floor executive suite. The doors slid open silently, revealing my spacious, newly renovated office. I walked over to the massive mahogany desk and sat down in the high-backed leather chair. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting on the brutal, unavoidable truth of the past few months. Society feeds us a relentless, comforting lie about the fundamental nature of family. We are constantly told that blood is thicker than water. We are socially conditioned to believe that sharing a genetic code or a last name automatically grants a person a permanent, irrevocable pardon for any level of betrayal. We are taught to forgive our relatives endlessly, to turn the other cheek, and to sacrifice our own peace of mind to keep the family tree looking perfectly intact for the neighbors. That is a dangerous, highly toxic philosophy designed to keep strong people tethered to weak, parasitic individuals. Blood is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. DNA does not excuse extortion, federal fraud, or a coordinated, malicious attempt to destroy a man's life. In the commercial construction business, when you discover a massive patch of dry rot or a colony of termites eating away at a load-bearing wooden pillar, you do not try to negotiate with the decay. You do not paint over the rotting wood and pray that it magically heals itself. If you ignore it, the rot will inevitably spread to the surrounding healthy timber, and eventually the entire roof will collapse and crush everyone inside. You have to take a heavy steel saw, cut the infected wood completely out of the structure, and throw it directly into the fire. The exact same brutal logic applies to human beings. When a limb becomes entirely necrotic, infected with deadly, fast-moving gangrene, a trauma surgeon does not hesitate. If he refuses to amputate the arm out of sentimentality, the poison will race straight to the patient's heart and kill him within hours. Kendrick and Heather were the gangrene infecting my life. They were a fast-moving, lethal poison trying to stop my heart and consume my resources. I did not want to cut my own son out of my universe. No father ever wakes up wanting to sever that deep, fundamental biological bond. But he forced my hand the exact moment he actively participated in a scheme to steal my legacy and lock me away from my own property with a fraudulent restraining order. I had to sever the limb to save the body. I had to fiercely protect the empire I built with my split knuckles. In the 1980s, the reputation I earned through decades of honest labor, and the pristine memory of my late wife. I refused to be a victim of my own massive success. I refused to let the wealth I generated become a weapon used against me by the very people I tried to elevate out of hardship. Loyalty is not a biological inheritance that you simply receive at birth. It is a daily conscious choice demonstrated through action and respect. Kendrick chose treason. He chose the path of a coward. And the universe simply delivered the exact uncompromising invoice for his purchase. I stood up from the mahogany desk and walked over to the small, polished bar cart resting in the corner of the office. I opened a handcrafted wooden humidor and selected a premium dark-wrapped cigar. I picked up a heavy steel cutter, smoothly clipping the end of the tobacco with a sharp snap. I placed the cigar between my teeth, struck a long wooden match, and drew the hot flame into the tightly packed leaves. The rich, aromatic smoke filled the air, thick, heavy, and grounding. I walked back to the massive glass window and looked down at the sprawling city of Atlanta. The sun was beginning its final descent, casting a deep, fiery orange glow across the endless horizon of glass skyscrapers and crowded concrete highways. The chaotic noise of the millions of people rushing through the streets below was completely muted by the thick, soundproof glass of my office. I was entirely insulated from the madness of the outside world. The silent correction was finally definitively complete. A sprawling, complex web of deceit had been aggressively dismantled without a single drop of actual blood being spilled. The people who foolishly mistook my quiet discipline for old age and weakness had learned a catastrophic, life-altering lesson. The manipulative woman who believed she could weaponize the justice system to steal my fortune is currently locked inside a small concrete federal cell, her freedom entirely stripped away for the next decade. The son who traded his backbone for a comfortable lie is currently breaking his back under the scorching Georgia sun, trapped in a relentless cycle of crushing, inescapable debt. They built their own cages, locked the heavy steel doors, and handed me the keys. I took a slow, deep draw of the cigar and blew the thick smoke against the cool glass. I am alone, but I am entirely secure. The parasites have been permanently eradicated. The foundation is solid rock once again. Those who deserve to be locked up are locked up, and the man who needed to be free is finally absolutely free. If there is one final truth you take away from my experience, let it be this: never let the comfort of family ties blind you to the reality of human nature. People will test the boundaries of your generosity, and if you do not enforce those boundaries with ironclad consequences, they will consume everything you have built. Real love and genuine respect are never owed to anyone simply because of shared genetics. They are earned every single day through loyalty and integrity. Protect your peace, safeguard your assets, and never be afraid to burn a rotting bridge to illuminate your path forward. If you believe in standing your ground and defending your legacy against toxic people, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below.